The state Senate apologizes for being late. And we're going to be jumping in right into the next thing, which is blockchain legislation in other jurisdictions. We're going to be walk through a spreadsheet, and members, you can find that in your book. And members of the public, that there are extra copies, I believe, on the back table in regards to the PowerPoint we're about to receive from Mr. Land. Mr. Land, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One of the principal reasons that I wanted to put this presentation together is there are a lot of jurisdictions in this race, you might call it, across the globe about who wants to be the premier blockchain jurisdiction in the country and in the world. So I thought it might be useful to kind of take a 50,000-foot view of what other jurisdictions are doing legally speaking, so we can kind of better inform our deliberations this interim and next year as we go into the legislative session. So I'm going to try to speed through this as fast as possible to help us kind of catch up on time a little bit, but feel free to let me know when you have questions, and we'll get started. So here's kind of an outline of my presentation. First, we're going to start at the state level in the U.S. Then we're going to look at Congress, and then we're going to go overseas. The picture here is from the signing of House Bill 70 on March 10th. If any of you guys remember that, most of it, yeah.
Good looking folks. Yeah, that's my shirt suit. Yeah, like we're together.
All right, so first we'll start with state legislation and regulations in the U.S. So utility tokens. Wyoming was the Wyoming legislature was the first representative body in the world to create a legally distinct asset category for digital assets, blockchain-based tokens. It was so great. What's the old adage that imitation is the sincerest form of flattery? Arizona promptly copied House Bill 70 and enacted it into their law. Colorado tried the same thing, but it passed and then it failed, depending on whose story you believe. But it ultimately went down. The Colorado Attorney General was opposed to their version of House Bill 70, so it went down. So right now, House Bill 70 is law in Wyoming and Arizona, and I believe North Dakota and New Hampshire may look at moving forward with House Bill 70 in the future.
Go ahead.
May I ask one quick question? The Arizona bill, did it go as far as Wyoming's to exempt utility tokens from the securities and money transmitter laws?
Mr. Land?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It was an omnibus bill. It substantially went as far as House Bill 70. It wasn't exactly the same, but they took a significant portion of House Bill 70 and attached it to the end of one of their crowdfunding bills. And they also had the money transmitter exemption too.
Mr. Land, I also believe that the version of Arizona actually, much like crowdfunding, had a limitation or a cap on as far as what you could do with an ICO. Is that correct?
I believe that to be correct, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you.
So we'll move on. The regulatory sandbox. This is kind of a popular notion in the UK and Arizona. It's basically kind of a controlled regulatory environment. A regulatory sandbox is you submit details about what your fintech proposal is, and we're going to see whether that meets certain minimal consumer protection standards. And then we're going to exempt you from certain consumer protection and other legal requirements that would normally be applied to fintech proposals. And we're basically going to give you a trial run in the market and see how it goes. Arizona recently, in March 2018, enacted sandbox legislation. And the UK is also looking at it as well. And I'll come back to that when we kind of go overseas. But Arizona kind of has like a controlled test environment for fintech products that they're asking developers and other fintech companies to come to their state and kind of trial run their products in Arizona on a limited basis.
Mr. Land, has that been proven to that regulatory sandbox kind of idea? It seems like that's kind of almost the an unknown axe, so to speak, for some of these companies. Is that proven to be popular? Or is that something that's been worthwhile for the state of Arizona?
The state of Arizona has only had this on their statute book for 2 months, so I don't know there's a lot of data, but when we get to the UK, they have a lot more experience with their sandbox, and they actually have some measurables that I put in on the slide that we'll get to if that's okay, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Taxation, there's been a little bit more activity in taxation. Wyoming, of course, exempted cryptocurrency from property taxation. Nevada, they only meet every 2 years. In last legislative session, they prohibited localities from taxing blockchain activities. Vermont, in a bill that actually came up, it's still being considered in their legislature right now, they proposed a cryptocurrency tax of 1 penny on every crypto transaction. They subsequently took that out of the bill, though, because it faced some opposition from the crypto community, unsurprisingly. Then Georgia, Arizona, Illinois, and Vermont are considering accepting crypto as payment for taxes or state licenses. No one's been successful yet. Georgia's bill died, and Arizona's was vetoed, and the Illinois and Vermont bills are still pending.
Mr. Chairman,
Yeah, go ahead, Ms. Swan.
question, has anyone related to these tax bills changed their legal tender laws to include crypto as legal tender? A number of states did what Wyoming did last session and accept something other than the US dollar as legal tender, namely, I think we did gold and silver. Has anyone included crypto?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't believe so.
Okay, continue, Mr. Land.
Government records, there's a little bit more activity in this area. A lot of states have created a task force much like this one to consider transitioning some governmental records to a blockchain. There's the legislation right there. I've listed out California, Colorado, Illinois, Maine, New Jersey, New York, and Virginia. Florida.
Mr. Land, has any of those states done it via an amendment to their budget? Or were they all bills creating the task force?
I can't speak with exact certainty, but I believe they were all standalone bills.
Gotcha. Thank you, Mr. Land.
Thank you. Florida had a fairly innovative proposal. There was a bill to issue driver's licenses, an e-driver's license on a blockchain in Florida, but it died. And then West Virginia has this really innovative proposal they're going to allow overseas military members to vote via blockchain app. And they're trying to, that's a pilot project mainly. And they've indicated that if that's successful, they're going to roll it out to a broader voting population, maybe in future elections. And that was not legislation. The Secretary of State of West Virginia just took that upon himself to do that. Corporations and business filings. Wyoming passed House Bills 101 and 126 in this session. Delaware passed their corporate records bill in 2017. It was much like Wyoming's bill. Currently in Delaware right now, they're doing a pilot project in the Secretary of State's office to do Uniform Commercial Code, UCC, filings. They're only doing a very small subset of their UCC filings. There's many more that may incorporate into the mix in the future. But that's kind of where Delaware is. And I do believe there's a presentation on Delaware's activities in your meeting materials as well that I included. California is currently considering a corporate records bill similar to the one we passed, Senate Bill 838. And I believe Nevada, when the Nevada legislature meets next year, they will pass probably something along the lines of what we did, because they're one of the big 3 corporate venues in America, and they'll probably want to try to keep up. So, smart contracts. Tennessee passed a very, very limited smart contract bill this legislative session. The definition of smart contracts was very, very narrow, and it just provided that they are enforceable, and if you entrust your data to a blockchain, you still own it. It's very, very minimal. Honestly, the only remarkable thing out of that piece of legislation was how they defined smart contract, and it's pretty inflexible, so they may end up coming back to amend it soon anyway.
Mr. Chairman?
Yeah, go ahead, Senator.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is something we were discussing at lunch, actually, was the validity and standing of contracts in Wyoming that would be blockchain transactions, how courts would perceive that. Do we have anything in statute right now? Should we consider something along these lines, but obviously more flexible and forward-looking?
Go ahead, Mr. Land.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There is nothing in statute currently about the validity. It would just proceed like a normal contracts case. The court would, look at look at the four corners of the contract and take all the other things into consideration when they consider the contract. So I don't believe, I think it's kind of a gray area. I think they would be enforceable, but there could be some technological complications that may cause it not to be enforceable. So if this task force wanted to look at legislation to clarify certain aspects of the enforceability or the procedures of enforcing a contract in Wyoming, that might be warranted based on what some other states have done. That would be up to the task force.
Great, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Continue, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Florida, again, had a bill that provided that smart contracts were enforceable, but it died. And the only real activity in the smart contracts arena right now is in Malta, and we'll get back to that later in the presentation.
Okay.
Cryptocurrency licensing. Of course, everyone knows what New York has done with the BIT license. They basically require a governmental license to do cryptocurrency operations at all. Not many people have applied for BIT licenses, and the state of New York has been very slow in issuing them. Only a very small handful have been issued from August 2015 to May 2018. And corporations are actively moving out of New York because of the BIT license. And it's seen as very, very stringent.
Could we, is there a way we can contact those entities moving out of New York?
Yeah, that might, the Secretary of State's office might want to send them a letter and be like, hey, look at us. And then Banking Commissioner mentioned earlier about the Uniform Act, the Uniform Regulation of Virtual Currency Business Act that the Uniform Law Commission just issued. It's basically a licensing and oversight framework for cryptocurrency business. It's kind of like a money transmitter law, but just kind of updated for cryptocurrency. And it's being considered in Connecticut, but it died this legislative session in Nebraska and Hawaii. And no one's adopted it yet.
Mr. Land, can you explain why it died in Hawaii? Hawaii is one of the last remaining states with Money Transmitters Act that is essentially overreaching on digital currencies. And so I'm curious why Hawaii failed that legislation. You figure it would have been a fix for them.
Mr. Chairman, to be honest, I don't have a lot of detail on why it failed in Hawaii. If I recall, when I read about the bill, I just don't think it was high enough on their priority list to make the cut. I don't think it got a committee hearing. So,
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead, Senator.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On the Uniform Law Commission bill, that's another thing. Did you see anything in there that was statute that we should be taking a look at, that we should be considering, that we lack in our legal structure? Really, were there any red flags for you when you looked at that? I looked through it and I didn't honestly think that much of it, but what are your thoughts?
Mr. Land.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It was very similar to our existing money transmitter regime. There's not a lot of great difference. I think it's up to you, obviously, on what legislation you would consider. But I wouldn't, if I was running a business, I wouldn't be overly in favor of it being adopted. But that's just my opinion. I don't see a lot of difference. So
Thanks.
Okay, Mr. Land.
Now we're going to D.C., the United States Congress. As you can imagine, Congress has its mind on a lot of things at the moment, and cryptocurrency is definitely not a priority in D.C. at the moment. Here's an outline of some of the bills that are out there. There's one bill, H.R. 3708. It provides a de minimis income tax exemption for gains attributable to cryptocurrency. I know there are a lot of new crypto millionaires out there that experienced paying taxes this year, and it wasn't a very pleasant opportunity for them. So this bill would basically just provide a higher threshold of an exemption from income tax for crypto gains, $600, which is not a great deal, obviously. There are some other bills on reports and strategies. Bills requiring the Department of Defense and the Department of Homeland Security to study blockchain. Then there's a lot of activity, unsurprisingly, on terrorist and hostile nation usage and money laundering relating to cryptocurrencies. There's a reward program for cryptocurrencies, cryptocurrency use in terrorist financing. Some bills to include crypto in the in the reporting requirement, if you ever try to fly from an airport with $10,000 in cash, you technically have to report that to customs. And there's a bill that says if you're going to transfer $10,000 in crypto, you have to report it to the Treasury too.
Mr. Land, in regards to cryptocurrencies and the illegal use or the use of cryptocurrency by terrorists, I think everybody's heard of the Silk Road and that aspect. But I guess I've always, the terrorist applications have always kind of been just a rumor. Is there any validity that you know of that? Is Al Qaeda using Bitcoin?
ISIS was.
ISIS was.
Yeah. What was that, Mr. Chairman?
I'm going to let Senator Rothfuss go ahead and put that one on the mic.
I don't know if it's micable, but my understanding from my readings was that ISIS has used cryptocurrencies.
And Senator Rothfuss, I guess it goes without saying, though, that other currencies have been used by ISIS.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. It's handy.
Gotcha.
And the U.S. dollar is ubiquitous around the world, so it's not like it's just focused on cryptocurrency. So.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, Mr. Pope.
Quick question. When I'm reading this, and if it's defining cryptocurrencies as currency, how does that interact with IRS Notice 2014-21, which classifies cryptocurrencies as property and subject to capital gains? Would any of this override an IRS notice which has not been either turned into a regulation or a statute?
Mr. Land?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It is a piece of legislation, so the IRS notice would fall to the bill if it passed, or even if it was turned into a regulation, the bill would stand.
Very good.
But there hasn't been any movement on HR 3708, so I don't really foresee it becoming law.
Mr. Olson, or Representative Olson, pardon me.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Lund, I just wanted to circle back to this House Resolution 5036. I'm just wondering if you had any more information about, I don't know when that went into effect, or if there has been any, rewards issued regarding tips using it. And then I'm wondering if you have just a little more information on this resolution, because the way I read this bullet point, it seems to say, okay, we're the U.S. government, we're going to give a reward to anyone who gives us a tip that there's an organization that is on the State Secretary of State's list of terrorist organizations who use cryptocurrency. Or is it more specific in how they use the currency, or is it just the simple fact that they use it?
Mr. Land?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That bill hasn't passed. It hasn't become law. The only bill on that list is the one that has an asterisk on it. The only bill up there that's actually passed is the one that has an asterisk by it. That's the third bullet point, HR 2810. All the other bills on there are, still pending and will probably die in committee at the end of the Congress. But the outlines of that bill is, it would be any use of cryptocurrency. It was fairly broad. I think the reward was $400,000 or something like that.
Please continue, Mr. Land.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There have been some hearings, and there's also a caucus. The House has been really active. The House Committee on Financial Services and the Committee on Space Science and Technology, they've held at least 5 hearings in 2018 on blockchain or fintech. They've touched on it in some way. The Congressional Blockchain Caucus is working on the Hill to build awareness, and that's Representative Polis from Colorado, although he won't be in the next Congress, and Representative David Schweikert out of Arizona. And there haven't been any major proposals for comprehensive blockchain or crypto legislation that have been introduced that I could find.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman,
You go ahead, Ms. Long.
I presume this is the right place to bring this up, which is that the biggest issue that is holding back Wyoming's success in realizing job creation and higher revenue to the state from the blockchain bills is federal securities laws. And as Mr. Land talked about, there have been multiple hearings in Washington about the SEC's interpretation of of utility tokens. They've not formally said anything about the Wyoming bill, but they have actually, thankfully, lightened the language that they've used. Back right when we were about to pass the bill here in Wyoming, Chairman Clayton said, "I've never seen an ICO that wasn't a security," and he's walked that back since. I'm wondering what this task force's role might be in getting involved and helping to clarify the federal issues, because that would help Wyoming's position. And it's notable that our Congresswoman is not part of the Congressional Blockchain Caucus. There is no caucus in the Senate. Senator Enzi's in an interesting position because he's on the subcommittee for small business and entrepreneurship. But we've not formally, to my knowledge, tried to engage with our Washington delegation. Is it within our purview to do that?
I don't know that it's outside of our purview. And that might be one of the aspects that we tackle after public testimony, is maybe think about a motion to send a letter to our federal delegation in regards to a request of formal attendance to that caucus. I think that's within the purview. Senators?
Yes. Absolutely.
Yeah. Representative? I like it. I guess so.
Good, thank you. At the appropriate time, I will so move.
Awesome.
We
Thank
can
you.
write letters.
And
We can
I
write
think
letters.
also it's worth noting, if I may, Mr. Chairman, that
Yeah.
we have some companies here who have publicly stated that the risk, they're taking personal risk to set up their business in Wyoming because of the federal securities risk that it poses to stay in the United States. And unfortunately, being in the Wyoming Blockchain Coalition, we've seen a number of companies that have elected to leave the United States because of not knowing what the SEC rules are. So it really, I think it would help us as a state, it would help our mandate as a task force if we could get the SEC to clarify. I realized originally they had accepted the invitation to come and then they elected not to. But this is, to me, the biggest obstacle to success right now is the opacity of the federal security standards.
Mr. Land, please continue.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So this is kind of where all the action's happening right now, overseas, beyond the shores of America. First of all, the United Kingdom. This comes back to the sandbox discussion we were having before. The UK has had a fintech sandbox in place since June 2016. And they've actually learned a lot about how sandboxes operate and how they could be improved and how they're successful. The Financial Conduct Authority is the UK regulator that's in charge of the sandbox. And they've noted that the regulatory sandbox has helped fintech companies reduce the time and cost of getting their ideas to market. And 90% of the firms which participated in their sandbox did a wider market launch after the sandbox had concluded. And 40% of the firms that participated in the regulatory sandbox received investment from private investors. But one challenge they noted was that providing banking services to the companies was somewhat of a challenge, and smaller firms sometimes struggled to attract customers. And the House of Commons has had one of its first blockchain hearings a couple weeks ago, and the UK Parliament's kind of busy with Brexit right now, but I do think blockchain is on their radar screen. So, Bermuda, not too far away. They're starting to get active in this space right now. They have the companies and LLC ICO Act. They're trying to impose a somewhat strict regulatory regime on ICOs. They're going to require approval from their Minister of Finance to issue an ICO and impose some fairly stringent investor disclosure requirements. They also have the Digital Asset Business Act that was just introduced recently. One thing that you might note is a lot of the dates on this presentation are really recent because all this stuff is happening right now, literally right now. And it's kind of a race to see who's going to have the most comprehensive regime. And there's stuff changing every day. So the Digital Asset Business Act just basically gives more supervisory authority to the Bermuda Monetary Authority. The Bermuda Premier, actually, probably the most notable thing on this slide is he announced that they're going to shift all their property records to the blockchain in Bermuda. So
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead, Representative.
And maybe I'm jumping ahead, Mr. Land, but I'm just skimmed through the other nation states that you're mentioning here. And this being so notable, the shift of the property deeds. I feel like I just read an article the other day about the nation state of Georgia putting all of its property deeds on the blockchain.
I think that's correct. I remember seeing a story about that too. But so kind of the focus of this presentation was kind of on the English-speaking countries because that's all their documents and regulations and laws are all in English. And since I don't speak Georgian, it would have been hard for me to really delve deep into that. But I do believe you're correct, and Georgia's looking at this as well. And as was mentioned earlier, Estonia is very active in adopting blockchain at the moment too.
Would it be possible to learn Georgian and report back to us on it?
If LSO wanted to pay for me to learn a language, I certainly wouldn't be opposed to that.
We can just take that up with management council. I'm sure they'd approve it.
Might have to vote on that.
Good idea.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Land, not to belabor, but I think you probably note this is significant, maybe for the same reason in my mind it is. And I had a client in my office the other day who's a dual citizen of Guatemala, and they don't have the record keeping system for real estate is very interesting there. It's simply do you have the deed in your safe or don't you?
Yeah.
There is you don't record those things. And then somewhere in the middle of the system is the state of Wyoming where we have file cabinets in the government office, and now since 1980 we have everything uploaded into a semi-server state. But then you have this nation state of Georgia, and now you got a country like Bermuda who's contemplating this whole new world where we put it on a blockchain. And I just think that's a tremendously significant leap when you have one area of the world where there's no government recording of deeds, and then on the other end we're going to have this global access to recording of deeds.
I would agree with everything you just said. That's accurate. And so we all remember law school and the bar about all.
I don't remember law school.
Oh yeah,
for him.
Sorry, Mr. Chairman. Sometimes I just assume. I just assume that.
We're all lawyers.
Yeah, and that's probably a mistaken assumption. But Mr. Chairman, can I request a brief recess? It looks like my battery is. I have a battery issue.
No.
Yeah, go ahead and take a timeout.
Okay.
We'll find out a way. We'll harass Representative Olson for about 5 minutes here. Yeah. Members, I do think it's and just going through these other ones also, I think it's probably important to note that while we've got those deeds, what other records would be possible to be stored on it? I mean, obviously you can put anything on a blockchain, but what would be of sincere interest to the state or to companies coming to the state?
Mr. Chairman, auto titles, the healthcare records, there are literally no end to the possibilities of the records that would be more efficiently kept on a blockchain and more transparent and more accessible.
Ms. Long, I know you're ready.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I'm thinking through it because of learning earlier about the IT architecture of the state. Having worked with Delaware previously, the state of Delaware actually handles IT for a lot of its towns and counties. So it made sense. The Delaware Public Archives project is actually underway to put archival records on a blockchain, literally to reduce the paper that's being stored in warehouses. And the reason a blockchain made sense is because of the number of towns and counties that are sharing records on a shared ledger system, and the fact that it all has to be transparent anyway when it goes to the archive. So I don't know who handles property deeds in Wyoming. Perhaps someone else on the task force does.
Yes, sir. Let's wait till we get to public comment. I'm sorry, Mr. Allen. I got my orders. Otherwise, management council wraps me in it. Go ahead.
I'll answer that. The property deeds are handled by your county clerks. They're all there. And actually, one of the big ones that's there beyond property deeds is your mineral deeds. You know, right now they're a mess. They require tens of thousands of dollars a hand search. We talked about it lunchtime for these companies to come in, and it's hard to ascertain who actually owns them. It can cost, if you own a ranch, it can cost you tens of thousands of dollars to prove who owns the minerals under them, which nearly always happens on trade ownership. So blockchain would be really good. Those are really vulnerable. No taxes paid on minerals. So someone can actually transfer, i.e. your place, Tyler, and you might not catch it for 20 years that someone's transferred the minerals to themselves because there's no notice goes to you in the courthouse. So all of a sudden the mineral company shows up on you and you say, hey, you never leased to me. And so this is a hard.
Senator Rothfuss is back. Don't say anything more about him.
Okay, we're all done now.
Meeting adjourned.
But I agree. I'll follow up a little. I think it's unlimited. I'd love to see the Secretary of State's office go totally digital. Chris and I were, Senator Rothfuss and I were listening about it. Seems to think it could be done reasonably priced probably, and I think it makes tremendous sense. Your guys' records, and you're good about having stuff online. It would simplify searches if we could get where we were totally digital on the blockchain. It's stuff that's used every day by lots of people.
And Mr. Chairman, would that
Go ahead, Ms. Long.
include, Senator Driscoll, the mineral rights, or is that a county government obligation? Who handles the IT obligation for those? It's the counties?
Mr. Chairman, it's county, but the state could easily step in on this. The state has a definite interest in mineral rights statewide.
Mr. Land, I think you're back at it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Apologies. Apparently the surge protector under here doesn't actually work. So that's the reason my battery died. So I'm on power now, but for some reason there's a signal issue. But I'm just going to keep proceeding.
Yeah, was that me?
Yep. What's that? Is that recording? That could be of concern.
Yes, it could.
Is this one of those we're going to have to blame Kelly things?
No. It was recording a second ago when we started.
Did someone kick the power? Where's the power cable going to?
My money's on Driscoll.
The chair said no.
Exactly.
Is it not going?
It's off now, Mr. Chairman.
Let's go ahead and take a 5-minute recess. We'll come back. Or do you got it going now?
No.
Okay, yeah,
That's
let's.
my speech. How's that?
I know. Let's go do it. Take a 5-minute recess. Well, about 7-minute recess. Be back here at 3 o'clock, please.
We're just going to reenact everything.
Oh, we took 5 minutes?
Yep. Reenact it all.
10-minute break. So it's all
Even me talking shit.
started 5 minutes late.
Exactly. Good luck. I like
It's a
talking.
democratic way of doing things, I know, but.
Oh, you don't have minutes.
Well, I went out and put one in my car. So.
I have to pass.
Got it. Oh, got it?
There you go.
Okay, got it.
Oh, it's too late. I already told you we'd be back.
You already released the cat.
I already released the cat.
You can't just unrelease cats.
Think about the tokenization of real estate. That's one of the things that
Yep.
I'm going to recommend to House Bill 7.
Cool.
Is that we add where it says exchange for goods, services, content. I'd like to add
Good to meet you. Pleasure.
Good
to meet you. I
property.
appreciate
whether
what you're
real
doing
or
today.
personal.
Thank you so much.
Oh, cool.
That'll-
I think
Okay.
That'd be good.
Yes.
No, I'm on board, man. You let her.
Well, think
Go
about
off.
it. Think about it with ranches. And I can give you a use scenario there. Okay.
Yeah, I would hope so. I wish we had a little more control over it. Obviously, the SEC holds us back in a lot of the things we'd like to do. Yeah.
Well, safe travels. Safe travels.
Yes, travel safe, and I'm terribly sorry you can't be here tomorrow, but it was really nice meeting both of you in person.
Oh, yes.
Good. These guys have an incredible solution for artists and artist management in treating their rights in a stock market way.
Nice.
It is, I was just blown away by the site. Yes.
To allow us to give a presentation.
Yeah, that'd be
We
great.
can do the Skype.
That sounds great. Yeah, please do. Thank you.
Because we have some other ideas now. Unfortunately, we cannot be here for tomorrow's session,
Right.
but we have other ideas how to generate revenue for the state.
Great.
And we'll be working with Mr. Pope, Blockchain Coalition, great resource. I was actually surprised when I discovered that Blockchain Coalition exists, you know, and then the initiative that Mr. Pope started.
Great. Well, thank you. Yeah, I look forward to that. Yeah, contact me and we'll set up a time.
Hopefully, your whole team will be able to come to the next meeting in September. So
Yeah.
hopefully, everybody
Excellent.
will be able to be here for the next meeting.
I can't wait to see you guys.
Nice to meet you both. Take care.
Take care.
So I heard yesterday that Delaware was pushed out into a I saw the red line was everything was scratched out. And we're going to be in the task force. Two from Delaware, two from this. So would you guys not use there's some things, I'm trying to jump in this, there's some subtleties in there that I
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Where's your Senate district, Chris?
We're in it. So Senate District 9 is Laramie in the city, west of 15th Street.
Awesome.
Yeah, it's all within city limits, so I can walk my district. I'm one of those rare, lucky folks that unlike Ogden. I don't think Ogden would survive a walk of his district.
Yeah, I know. When I ran, it was half of my district was in town and half of it county, and those were the toughest days because even the just walking the driveways and driving.
Coming back in, we've got enough for quorum. Ms. Long will have to forgive us. Mr. Land? Mr. Land, continue, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to apologize to all the members of the task force. I should have made sure all my ducks were in a row before I started, but apologies for that. So we'll keep on moving. Gibraltar, another English-speaking dependency of the United Kingdom. There was some discussion earlier. One of the previous presenters talked about Wyoming creating a token exchange within the state. Gibraltar has already taken that step. They created the Gibraltar Blockchain Exchange in 2017. It's compliant with all the relevant anti-money laundering requirements, and they are issuing their own ICO this year. And their marketing is like the premier token launch platform and exchange in the world.
Mr. Land, have they seen, I mean, granted, I know all these are relatively new, but have they seen traction because of that action?
They have. They've been marketing themselves fairly heavily at all the trade shows in Europe, and they have had, if you see the quote on the second bullet point there, I think that fully explains it. Many firms have been craving for a jurisdiction to regulate them, and a lot of developers in Europe see Gibraltar as like this common law-based jurisdiction that has friendly business laws, and at the same time has kind of a light touch regulatory framework that gives them certainty, but at the same time allows them to innovate. So there's been a lot of demand that I've seen on at least through my research about Gibraltar and their activities in this area. And they're going to do more comprehensive ICO legislation later this year, more along the lines of House Bill 70 probably, but can't give you official word on that.
Okay.
Malta is kind of the other big player in Europe right now. The Maltese Parliament is imminently going to introduce 3 bills, kind of a comprehensive look at blockchain. They're going to create a new government department in the Digital Innovation Authority bill, kind of governs blockchain, smart contracts, AI, and the Internet of Things. The second bill is probably the most important, the Technology Arrangements Bill. They're going to attempt to regulate smart contracts and provide like a certification scheme for technology arrangements. So when they say technology arrangements, they mean smart contracts, but they also mean any other kind of contract or arrangement that includes a component where you're depending on AI or automation to carry out that function of the contract. So their definition of technology arrangements is actually broader than smart contracts. So they're going to try to become a leader in that space. The third bill is the Virtual Currencies Bill. They're going to regulate ICOs and do virtual currency standards and money transmission requirements. And a little more to the gaming discussion that we had before lunch, the Malta Gaming Authority. Malta is kind of known as a destination for gaming in the Mediterranean, and they have a regulatory sandbox for blockchain-based gaming projects that they're going to pilot this year.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Hong Kong, over to Asia now. China banned ICOs on the mainland. The government did, but Hong Kong is part of the One Nation, Two Systems arrangement under China, so they still operate under English common law mostly. So ICOs and virtual currency activities are very, very common in Hong Kong, and the government has kind of adapted kind of a laissez-faire approach. They don't really feel the need to regulate at this point. They're kind of in a wait-and-see mode to see what happens. And the Hong Kong Monetary Authority is that's the regulatory body. They're attempting to introduce a blockchain-based solution to their stock exchange to kind of automate some of those areas. And the Hong Kong Insurance Authority is piloting an insurtech sandbox to adopt blockchain in the insurance industry in Hong Kong. So. Switzerland are one of the major players in Europe. The Financial Market Supervisory Authority issued their their big groundbreaking ICO guidance in February 2018. It's very close to what we did in House Bill 70. So I think they kind of influenced us, and we influenced them when they drafted their guidance. They created 3 kinds of tokens: payment tokens, which are basically cryptocurrency, which is subject to anti-money laundering requirements; utility tokens, which is basically House Bill 70. And then asset tokens, which are similar to equities, bonds, and derivatives, and they're subject to the anti-money laundering requirements. And the Swiss Parliament is also going to consider creating crypto banks, which is basically a depository institution that's kind of exempt from all the banking laws, and they're allowed to transact in digital currency, but they would have a different regulatory scheme than other banks in Switzerland. And some last notes. South Korea banned ICOs, but they may be in the in the midst of reversing their stance, and they're planning to issue some regulations to allow ICOs again. Venezuela they issued a national cryptocurrency called the Petro in January 2018 to evade U.S. sanctions against them, and each Petro is backed by a barrel of Venezuelan oil, which is currently valued at $60 approximately. And Russia is thinking about introducing the crypto ruble, and they're also assisting Venezuela with selling the Petro to evade U.S. sanctions. So that's kind of where some of the money laundering, rogue nation financing issues that are being discussed in the U.S. Congress have come from, I think. And that's all for my presentation. I've given you a lot of background documents in your meeting materials. I provided you with a document from the UK and Malta and Delaware and Gibraltar. That's just background reading material if you want a little more context about my presentation. It kind of goes into detail about what their thinking is on digital assets. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, and extremely well done, Mr. Land. That was fantastic. I knew about a lot of these, but not all of them, and I'm fairly plugged in. So well done. Any questions for Mr. Land?
Mr. Chairman?
Go ahead, Senator.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A lot of these are the international initiatives. We don't have the authority to actually carry out if we chose to in Wyoming. We would be able to change federal law, which I don't think we can do as a task force. Were there any, though, that you did identify that would be potentially viable, that seem within the realm of our authority?
Mr. Land.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The property idea about transitioning property records to the blockchain, that's actually on the agenda for tomorrow.
Right.
Based on what Bermuda and Georgia have done. There are also some states in the U.S. have a lot more freedom under the Constitution because of federalism and, the way our constitutional structure is set up. So I would push back a little bit gently on the notion that Wyoming, there's a lot we can't do. We just have to be careful about how we approach it. For instance, like adopting a property-based approach to digital assets versus kind of a securities approach might be an alternative for us to do some more activity in the ICO realm versus just providing more securities exemptions. That might be something for the task force to think about.
Ms. Long.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Land, did you see anybody who actually defined utility tokens that way as property, as a new class of property?
Mr. Land.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. No.
Any other questions for Mr. Land?
Mr. Chairman, I do have one follow-up remark I would like to make to Ms. Long. I looked at the Arizona bill, how they copied House Bill 70 again, and they actually copied the first iteration of House Bill 70, so the one that was introduced, not the one that was enacted. So all the consumptive language, the notice of intent, et cetera, was not in the final enacted version of the Arizona bill. They call them virtual coins instead of open blockchain tokens. But everything else about that is basically taken from House Bill 70. So,
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead, Representative.
Mr. Land, circling back to this topic that intrigues me, which is the property records on, I'm trying to remember, I'm flipping through my packet here, which country that was.
Bermuda.
Okay, and was that an enacted legislation or something they're working on or proposed?
The Bermudian premier basically announced that his government was going to pursue it in the Bermudian Parliament this year, so it will require some enabling legislation. But the way the parliamentary system works, he's a majority in Parliament, so it'll probably become law.
So I'm just curious, we don't have any greater idea of what they envision in terms of a framework, a transition system. Do they have a system where, I don't know how that nation functions in the United States, and we started to get into this conversation earlier. We keep our property at the county level all across the country. That's where we record them.
Sure.
And so I don't know how comparable that is, if Wyoming wanted to do something like that, what would the transition look like other than just saying, hey, everyone put it on a blockchain, right?
Sure.
What would that look like?
Mr. Land.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Bermuda, I'm just going to kind of guess about. Bermuda, their population is very small. It's around the 50,000 mark, I would guess, and I would bet that they have a centralized land registry for the entire territory, and so they might have less transactional costs than Wyoming because we have a more decentralized system. A pilot project in Wyoming might be a way to proceed if we wanted to see how this worked. Choose a county or two in a part of the state that was willing to kind of that was willing to adopt the technology and see how it goes, and learn from the challenges and the issues that happen in those counties, and then kind of move forward on a more comprehensive basis after the pilot project.
Ms. Long?
Mr. Chairman, may I add some color to that? One of the things that would be easy for a county like Crook County that wanted to step forward and do this was discussed in Delaware, which is just put a hash of the property records on the blockchain that you would know if anything changed, so that if somebody produced records that were different, then you would be able to verify that something changed in those records. That can be done today with no heavy lift whatsoever.
So, and just as a question to you, Ms. Long, so you're talking about just putting a hash on something like the Bitcoin blockchain?
Yes,
okay.
Just like Senator Driscoll did with his calves last week.
Gotcha.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to
Mr.
follow up
Land.
one more quick thing for Senator Rothfuss's question earlier. I thought a little bit more about your question, and some of the ideas that are on the agenda for later today and tomorrow are kind of drawn from other jurisdictions, like the personal information trust companies. That was created out of the Vermont blockchain bill that's currently in process up there right now. The property idea tomorrow is from Bermuda, and the smart contracts, depending on how the committee would like to proceed, might be heavily influenced by how Malta proceeds. I definitely think the state would have the authority to regulate smart contracts, because that's a contracts issue, not a securities issue. But thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Any further questions for Mr. Land? Seeing none, thank you, Mr. Land. We're going to move to public testimony. I see Commissioner Faulkner is chomping at the bit. He's excited. Got some banking amendments for us.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Sorry, I was a little late coming back from lunch. Couldn't resist the Crowbar and Grill downtown, and went a little slower than I thought, but highly recommend the Kingbird if you ever go there. Anyway, so I apologize. There's a few things. I looked over the slides, and the things I wanted to comment on, just to kind of update you on how they're, again, intersecting in our space, and add a little more. So if I'm repeating what Mr. Land said, I apologize. I want to touch base on the Sandbox. That's a issue that is become one of the number one buzzwords in the regulatory world is sandboxing, and what that looks like, and how do you do that. I can tell you, my colleagues across the country, the opinions are varied. I was actually just talking to Treasurer Gordon yesterday, day before, about maybe this is something as a state we want to consider. There's right ways to do it, and there's wrong ways to do it. The thing about Arizona that was interesting is that they basically pulled it out of their banking agency. However, they're the licensing and supervisory authority for the entities that would be operating in this sandbox space. So I'm not quite sure how that works. I haven't had a chance to talk to the commissioner down there yet on when you pull that out of the supervisory's authority to at least opine on and monitor and look for consumer protections. How does that work?
Are you, Mr. Commissioner, are you aware of any FDIC action against Arizona in that regard?
No, no. And this would probably, my guess is it's going to be in the non-depository space, the licensed consumer lending, things like that. That's where a lot of this, again, because that's at state law level, it doesn't require federal approval. I know that consumer groups are very reticent to adopt this because the potential for consumer harm while you're operating inside a sandbox. What's a tolerable threshold? Are we going to allow some consumer harm while we figure out if this will work or not, if it needs oversight or not? And so my colleague would say you can't harm one consumer. The other says, well, as long as we've got remedies in place to make them whole, then we can do it and figure out if there needs to be sideboards on it or not. Illinois, and I don't know if that was brought up, they are in the middle of a statewide sandbox initiative. I can't remember what the origin. It's either the House or the Senate. I believe it passed the House in Illinois. Their commissioner is very supportive of the Sandbox initiative up there, and they're doing a lot of progressive type ideas of exploring them anyway. And so that's something, again, so I think we would be open to the concept. Not quite sure what it would look like. Again, we got to figure out what the tolerance threshold is with the sandboxing. And so,
Mr. Chairman?
Yeah, go ahead, Senator.
On the Arizona Sandbox or even Illinois, is there any state assumption or backstopping or insurance of liability? Or is it just, we're going to say that we're going to hold you harmless on behalf of our people?
Mr. Chairman, Senator, I don't know. I haven't studied the details of it. In fact, I've got the Illinois commissioner now sits on the executive committee of Conference of State Bank Supervisors with me. So I've got that's on my to-do list to get an update, see where it's at, and to see what kind of, what is the assumption. Now, there are players out there that say, no regulation, don't touch it. You're just getting in the way. And so let us go about, because they see them as software companies and not financial service providers. And then there's others that fully understand and appreciate consumer protection. And obviously the states are, hopefully somewhere in the middle of that, not shirking the responsibility that we have for consumer protection, but also not prohibiting, potential for innovation and economic expansion. In fact, that's part of our mission statement. So, that's the thing. Again, I think it can be explored, and this is one of those, being a regulator, I don't necessarily want to lead the charge in something, but I will be very eager to learn. And it's also a resource issue. I mean, I think if we get to those discussions, what kind of resources, because you've got to be willing to allocate resources to do that. And so, again, I don't even know what that takes. So I wanted to just say that there is that going on, and it's something, again, through CSBS that we're looking at through this FinTech advisory panel. And as I was sitting listening earlier today, I might reach out, and Mr. Chairman, reach out to you. They might be our representative for CSBS who staffs that, might be someone who we would want to have at the next meeting who can speak. He's had these meetings where I haven't been necessarily part of, but I'll check on that if you'd like. The other one is I wanted to comment on is the cryptocurrency licensing again, and then the Virtual Currency Business Act. So the BIT license is an interesting concept. And New York is trying to find a way to address this, so I applaud them for that. I don't know very many out there that actually like it.
I think the word is overreach.
Yeah, and I know the superintendent in New York fairly well, and while she appreciates innovation, it's very much consumer protection first.
Sure.
Maybe a little difference of opinion on how you do that, but so I don't think it's got the traction they were hoping for, but at least to me, the benefit is it gives us something to look at and to see, okay, what do we like of this? What don't we like of it? And then what they also have out of New York is, and I think maybe it's mentioned earlier today, is they have a special purpose, basically trust license. And so Gemini and ItBit are under that aspect. It might be the loophole that they were looking for to get into states, and this is basically they're acting a custodian. In Wyoming, they can't because of our trust laws doesn't recognize a branch of a out-of-state trust company, and so that will be a policy decision. In fact, we'll be talking about that next week in the Minerals Committee in our trust revisions. But do we want to look at that? But so there's all of these things. I guess what I'm saying is that as it evolves, we as a state can start borrowing from, and tomorrow I'll talk some more about my conversations with the Deputy Commissioner from Vermont and their thoughts on what's going on there regarding the personal information trust company and some of that. So, but we have thought about that, and like I said, we're always open to direction or suggestion and see what we can do in this space, but we are aware of a lot of this.
Senator.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In this instance, the consumer protection is all based on making someone whole if they have a financial loss. So this is a relatively clean space. It's not like someone's going to get injured or have health problems. It'll come down to dollars lost if we if we end up having a corporation that's exploited or whatever the case may be. And you look back at the original purpose of the FDIC and the idea that you can basically insure against that. We could potentially take one of these models where we come up with a sandbox and then have some type of insurance against loss, have a maximum on it just like you do with the FDIC so that no individual could be reimbursed more than whatever that potential risk would be. And actually do a good job of providing consumer protection while having a full sandbox. So you just do whatever the hell you want, but we'll make sure that the state provides some level of scrutiny. First of all, you wouldn't approve just anyone. Even the sandboxes we saw had some application process. You could do a quick risk analysis, come up with what the assessments were, and then we'd have an insurance against that. So you can kind of have the best of both worlds where we're not going to have our people be fleeced, but we can have the experimentation and the innovation taking place in Wyoming.
And that could be a possibility, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Senator. That it could be. Sounds like a new business line for the state of Wyoming as a insurer, and we can draw in the premium revenue. Is that?
Absolutely.
No. Anyway, there's a number of things going on, and so if we into some of these things, and I can research and try to get some more information for you on a couple of the topics that were raised. So, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Any other questions? Seeing none. Thank you. Mr. Allen. And once again, just for the record, sir, could you state your name?
Yeah. Christopher Allen, Blockchain Commons. Mr. Chairman, representatives, thank you very much for this pretty wide-ranging conversation. I track a lot of this area, and there may be some other weak signals that you may want to investigate or look into. First off, some low-hanging fruit that other organizations or other government institutions have been looking into of things they can implement now as proof of concepts or to get the ball rolling are trying to address some of the challenges of privacy. So trying to begin with healthcare records or begin with employment information, things of that nature, you end up having to also tussle with privacy laws, HIPAA, employment laws, et cetera. Places where there is voluntary or required self-disclosure, on the other hand, explicitly can be allowed. So the categories for that include things like educational credentials. I've graduated from Wyoming High School or from UW. Professional licensing, where I am mandated that I must publicly display my credential information or at on demand. Things like restaurant health certifications, anything where the government, for other reasons, has said you must share this information or someone voluntary wishes to share it, are good opportunities to leverage blockchain technologies. Regarding your research overseas, the city of Zug, it's not, so Switzerland is a federated system, a lot like the United States in the sense that each of the 19 subgroups have very independent rules and regulations that are in some ways higher than the state of Switzerland. The city, and I believe, I don't know what their county, their state. Canton, that's it. Zug has been doing a lot of experiments in this space, including citizen voting and whatever. And I would not just look at Switzerland as a whole, I would definitely look at Zug and the city services and county services or canton services that they're offering there. I think there are a lot of things in that family you might be able to do as well. There are a number of things that have been outside, I haven't been hearing the scope of, that are happening in other US states around things like benefit corporations or L3Cs, other kinds of forms where there are voluntary associations that basically say we want to do something for the long term, or our goal isn't necessarily to make a profit. We don't want to apply for a nonprofit status, but we want to maintain this ballpark, or we want to maintain this property for our heirs, or a variety of things. And so there have been some new corporate forms in other states to support this. There really is no equivalent in Wyoming. All of these could also use blockchain technologies. I concur with the discussion about bonds. There are a lot of things where you can basically, either an individual company or as part of a consortium of companies that are wishing to offer a new capability or whatever that is risky, that they can collectively offer a bond insurance on that. And that also can be done in a cryptographic fashion such that it can be, one, prove that it's solvent, and two, all it requires is a digital signature to basically release the funds to them or to you, depending on the nature of the contract with the state to offer those sandbox services. Next category, property deeds. I know there's a lot of thought here as far as this might be a great low-hanging fruit. I do want to be a little sensitive as to bringing my cryptographer hat on. It is a powerful area. The problem with property deeds is they need to last a really long time. You might need to refer to these property deeds 70 years from now or 100 years from now. The digital signature technology that we use today is not rated for more than another 20 or 30 years. It's going to be constantly changing. Whether or not quantum is real or not, it's a possibility. Whether or not there's an attack or whatever, we don't know. These days, the low-hanging fruit in property deeds is, as Caitlin was discussing, a hash. Hashes are considered to be secure much longer term than digital signatures are. You can do a lot of things with hashes, hash trees, complex things called hash signatures that could add a lot of value to your deed and property systems. So I would start there and then figure out where you're going to do where you might need long-term signatures and address that separately. And that will basically lead me to my final item, which is in the international standards communities, we're increasingly moving from talking about signatures to talking about proofs. And so instead of, signature is a kind of proof. It's basically your proof that you're signing it. But there is other kinds of proofs that might be out there other than the traditional digital signature that are evolving. There are other kinds of things. I may not need to prove to you what my birthday is if you're a bar. I just need to prove to you that I'm over 21. So being careful, you don't need a digital signature of my birth date. You just need me to be able to present a valid proof that I'm over 21. And so as you're evolving these legislation, think about things of what do I actually need to be proved as opposed to what I need to have signed or hashed.
Any questions for Mr. Allen?
Mr. Chairman, may I just follow up? If you were to start hashing property records and recording that hash somewhere, would the Bitcoin blockchain be the optimal place to record it, or would you think that you'd want to record it somewhere else just because of the data? Hash
timestamps are very cheap to offer, especially because you can do them in trees. So you can put 1,000 of them together into a hash tree and only pay the small transaction fee for that one thing, rather than paying 19 cents or 20 cents or whatever the transaction fee is today, or the $10 or $19 it was back in January. But why not do it on multiple places? Why depend on one? You can put one on an Ethereum chain, you can put one on a Bitcoin chain, put one on a permission blockchain where the federation is all over the world in multiple jurisdictions. Cost is small. I say go both ways. Yes, proof of work makes Bitcoin my favorite candidate if you were to choose one, but I don't know why you would just choose one.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And thank you, Mr. Allen. When you're talking about proofs, that speaks directly to a couple of problems that accountants normally see, and one is in a supply chain and auditing a supply chain. And that in normal accounting, you have the buyer and the seller, and the proof is that they both agree that a transaction has taken place and the asset has changed ownership. But I think what you may be discussing, and what would help my field tremendously is having a third level of proof, which is the automatic verification through digital fingerprinting and other aspects. Is that one of the use cases you're
Yes.
talking about?
So there's definitely, first off, the word authentication and the word authorization in the cryptographic community are very different things. They both start with the same 4 letters, but they're different. So that distinction is not well understood, and it's important that we separate these over time. There are all kinds of security attacks that happen when you confuse these two things. So one area would be a proof that you have authenticated that you are David Pope is a very separate operation than the fact that some party has the authorization to sign a bill or to do different activities, given that they've been authenticated. So authentication and authorization, that's one aspect. But there's another aspect. Let's talk about your supply chain. We're all competitors. We all have other people that are offering different services, et cetera. I put something on the blockchain that basically says I'm giving you 100 head of cattle in exchange for however many thousands of dollars that is, and that's a sweetheart deal. And now all your competitors are well aware of how you're pricing and what you're doing, or maybe you're moving into another commodity or something. That becomes dangerous information for business confidentiality. We can now today with current technology, I can blind that transaction. I can set it up so that the world can know that you and I did a deal, and that the deal was fair. Nobody was cheated. It happened. It closed. The transfer, in both directions was complete. They can all know that happened, and nothing else. But you and I can basically disclose a different thing to our auditor that basically allows them with the single button go, yes, you actually did do this transfer, and did it properly with cattle for gold, or cattle for dollars, or cattle for Bitcoin. And these things can compound on each other. So you can actually solve ultimately someday the kind of 2008 problem where we had these non-cryptographic assets that were backed by assets that didn't have value, that were backed by assets that didn't have value and were resold. Instead, you can push a single button and basically do a proof of solvency all the way through all of the supply chain to know whether or not somebody down the line actually can provide the promises that they've made. So those are proofs, and that's the future of this technology. That's what's emerging.
Mr. Chair.
Pope.
And yes, then because buyer and seller can collude in order to defraud the supply chain. But if you have that third level of proof through the digital fingerprinting, and this may date me, probably does, but when I was going through accounting school, the case study was a case called Miniscribe, and where the management of Miniscribe throughout the supply chain colluded with everybody to defraud their investors. So so yes, the proof, the level of proof, and that third level of proof, other than just authorization, going down all the way to authentication, is what's most important.
Yes.
Any other questions for Mr. Allen? None. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Any other public comments? More? And just once again, just state your name for the record, please.
Hi, Sean Moore, Enterprise Technology Services, Chief Services Officer. One of the things that I guess I want maybe the committee needs to be aware of, if we hash and just put it on any old block, if we're looking at state resources, for example, I'm going to use Department of Family Services. They have rules and regulations from the IRS where that stuff cannot be stored off of, state property. And I just wanted the committee to kind of keep that in mind if we're crafting legislation and looking at doing possibilities. I think now I'm going to think just passionately, probably not from ETS or whatever, just myself. Thinking about the possibilities of what we could do here at the state or what could be done just in general. I think, probably a cool concept would be taking the Hathaway Scholarship. And, you know, you have to have classes, you have to have ACT test scores or SAT test scores, and you have to have validation that comes up to the university or the community colleges for that. And I think if you looked at that, perhaps that, that chain, or that, you know, that kind of concept there, I think you'd also be getting into a generation of students who would accept who really understand the blockchain and accept that. So I think that's one area of possibility. I think anything that we do in the state, for example, DFS and family services and the services that they provide people, SNAP payments and stuff like that, if those are recorded on the block, you can actually probably do some really cool deep dive analytics down the line of, you know, just exactly how much money was given in what areas and kind of track that down the line. There's a whole lot of cool possibilities. I'm going to leave the committee with this. When I first got into the stuff, it was obviously cryptocurrencies. Caitlin, you were my first presentation. And, you know, I looked at it from the cryptocurrency kind of point of view. But when I went to the Global Blockchain Summit, I think the most inspiring kind of thing, this isn't low-hanging fruit by any means for Wyoming, but the power of what this technology can do is, you know, in places like Libya and Africa, where like 50% of the population does not have a birth certificate, no identity whatsoever, they're using blockchain technologies with biometrics, because everybody, well, they don't have probably a birth certificate. A lot of folks have a phone. And if there's a way to record an identity, it stops human trafficking, or at least that's the concept. So there are really cool things that you can do with this technology. I just wanted to leave you guys with that one.
Mr. Chairman. Yeah, go ahead, Senator.
Thanks. Sean, you said that if you've got a record at DFS and you hashed it, that the hash couldn't leave the state or leave the premises, so to speak. Is that what you meant? Or well, because once you've hashed it, if it's a long enough record, I mean.
Mr. Moore.
Senator Rothfuss, right now what we're dealing with DFS, and it's not a blockchain thing, but we're trying to utilize the cloud, right? And so when we look at cloud options for Department of Family Services, the IRS has this thing called Pub 1075, and it's a long document, 190 pages of regulations of how they want their data kept. One of those are it cannot be kept in a foreign country. It has to be, you know, kept within the United States. I don't know if hashing a value, putting it on, say, the Bitcoin block, how many nodes are outside the United States. But if a piece of that data is as encrypted as it is still sitting outside the United States, does that violate what some federal regulations? And I guess that's more of the concept. What I'm trying to say is, even though I think it's probably as secure as anything can be, you still have these federal regulations that don't allow us to, I guess, push on to these technologies. We're having that issue with cloud right now.
Mr. Chairman?
Go ahead, Senator.
Well, I see it with the records, and I see it if the records are encrypted, but if the records are simply hashed as opposed to being encrypted, I don't see how that can be considered a record.
Yeah.
Mr. Moore?
I'm rising to the level of my incompetence right now, Senator Robbins. So I'm just thinking, I'm just thinking that I just was, when Mr. Allen was talking about, you know, hashing it and throwing it on a chain, and Caitlin was engaging in that conversation, I was just thinking, man, right now with some of the things that we're trying to do with Department of Family Services and utilizing Azure and whatnot, we have to go to their government cloud. We can't use anything outside of that.
Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Allen, would you like to?
Oh, sure.
So this is a little complex, but I think I can explain it. So one of the issues is reversibility. You cannot reverse a hash. You cannot. It is not an encryption. You cannot take a hash and turn it into into the actual information. However, it can, if improperly done, be used to fingerprint. So under GDPR regulations in Europe, anything that can be reversed and basically turned back into some kind of correlation back to an individual is considered personal information. it is not difficult to use nonces and other different types of techniques such that that is not possible. So you want in your regulations to say if it is not reversible and not correlatable to an individual, thus it is not personal private information. But it is still suitable to be used for proofs and all of these different types of things. You just need a proper security review of that procedure.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks.
Mr. Chair. Last one.
Certainly, Mr. Allen, a couple of things. First, the issue of hashing and the location of that and all of that. Would that not be more of an implementation issue to make sure that we are following all applicable regulations and guidelines in implementing this type of strategy?
It should be, but again, it's 190 pages written by people that may not have been aware of the latest technology. And you may have to actually, buck the system a little bit and say, and maybe you can in your data records law, have a little paragraph, information that is not, in the state of Wyoming, information that is not reversible and is not correlatable shall not be considered to be personal, identity information. And then,
Yep, go ahead.
And then one more question for the both of you, and is if we have that proof, that authentication through biometrics and other means, what would this do for the elimination or control of waste, fraud, and abuse, in especially in the social services area?
So it is very powerful. But I also need to put the caveat on it. So in India, they've basically implemented something called Aadhaar, which is a digital identification biometric for almost 1 billion people now. There have been, huge savings in abuse. But one of the problems is that it has introduced new kinds of human rights problems where, old women who are getting the pension from their, former Army dead spouse cannot get their pension money because their hands have gotten too old for their fingerprint to work. And the people that are trying to solve this don't have the right authority to be able to go and say that, oh, this device is wrong. There's something wrong here. We need to solve it. There's no recourse. It's just like, we can't give you the money. And there have been women who've died. There have been people who haven't received health care that should have, et cetera, et cetera. So we wrote up something called the 10 Principles of Self-Sovereign Identity to try to address these misuses. So I guess my answer is, yes, you can save money. Yes, you can prevent fraud. It can introduce new problems, and you just need to be careful about it, and you can prevent some of the new problems as well.
Any further questions for either Mr. Moore or Mr. Allen? Seeing none, thank you, gentlemen. Any further public testimony? Okay, we're going to go ahead and close public testimony in regards to the other jurisdictions aspect. Is there any motions or anything like that by committee members? Ms. Long?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I would like to move that this task force recommend an amendment to Wyoming's legal tender law to recognize cryptocurrencies.
Do I have a second?
Second.
Seconded by Mr. Pope. Is that anywhere else on our, would that be covered anywhere else on our agenda coming up there, Chris? Okay.
Mr. Chairman?
Go ahead, Senator.
I'd just like more explanation of how the legislation would be structured and what the intended implications are. Are we saying that the state of Wyoming would accept cryptocurrencies? All of them? What are the ramifications?
Ms. Long.
No, it would be, Mr. Chairman, very similar to the amendments that the legislature passed to the Legal Tender Act last legislative session regarding something other than the US dollar being accepted as legal tender in Wyoming. So there's a precedent. When I asked Mr. Land if there were a similar precedent elsewhere, he wasn't aware of any. But there are a number of states that have added things like gold and silver as legal tender in the state. Not to say that the state has to accept tax payments in that form, not at all.
Right.
One might question why bother doing this, but for the same reason that the legislature saw fit to do this with gold and silver. It gives flexibility and freedom to Wyoming citizens to use those other forms of, some might call small m money, for payment of debts and transactions in the state.
Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, go ahead, Senator.
But we had a similar debate in the legislature, and I was on the side of why do we even need to do this? Because there's nothing that precludes anyone from doing that now. So why do we need that statute?
So if I may, and I think this is an important aspect, and one of the aspects that was kind of unbeknownst in regards to the gold and silver legal tender piece of legislation is by making it legal tender, it is no longer sales taxable at that point. And that was one of the bigger aspects, is that a lot of states, when you buy gold and silver, there is a sales tax aspect to it unless it is considered legal tender. But because it is considered legal tender, it now falls under existing statute, which exempts it from sales tax. And it's arguable whether it was being collected or not in small portions or what throughout the state of Wyoming. But that was one of the side benefits. So on top of the aspect of calling it a legal tender and being able to trade, which is within the jurisdiction of the state to do so, there is the side benefit of taking advantage of that tax exemption.
Mr. Chairman, though, are you suggesting that right now, if we exchange cryptocurrency, if I give you a Bitcoin, you have to pay sales tax on that? Is that what you're suggesting?
Senator, I don't think it's out of the realm of the possibilities in regards to how sales tax can be collected. Until it's exempted or collected, we don't really know. And as it stands right now, we leave it up to the Department of Revenue.
If I'm giving you $100, Mr. Chairman, for a Bitcoin, you're saying that right now that could be considered a sale, even though we said that it's not property?
Yeah, we've said that is correct. We have said that it is not property taxable. And specifically in Senate File 111, that just covers ad valorem.
Sure.
When you're talking about other sales taxes, essentially at this point, I think it's one of the unbeknownst in a lot of states is there are these taxation actions that normally happen to even an ice cream cone. And it's understood that it happens to said ice cream cone. But when it comes to cryptocurrencies, there is no inherent knowledge or grasp. I personally don't think it's too far off that before governments start realizing, is my opinion, that there's more out there besides capital gains.
Mr. Chairman.
Oh, go ahead.
I just wanted to respond to Senator Rothfuss. I think one of the more practical implications of Ms. Long's proposal is I've been doing a lot of work lately with the implementation of smart contracts and trying to figure out how that would work. One of the issues that there's been a lot written about is if you can't find a mechanism for the US dollar, for example, to be the basis for the consideration of the smart contract, and cryptocurrency is, and there is a problem, can you enforce that contract if cryptocurrency isn't a legal recognized form of tender? So from a practical standpoint, I think this is a really big step in terms of creating a pathway for enforceability of smart contracts. I'll leave the tax debate to you guys. I wasn't even thinking about that aspect, but from a smart contract perspective, I think it does make a lot of sense.
And Mr. Chair?
Yeah, Mr.
Just a comment, if the Department of Revenue feels that it can enforce a sales tax on it, it will.
Right. That doesn't blow me away, Mr. Pope. It scares me. So who is our move? Ms. Long moved that. Our second was Mr. Pope. Is there any other discussion? Mr. Land, do you understand the motion? Correct. Basically, yeah, basically taking the legislation from last year in regard to precious metal and any other discussion? Oh, yeah, go ahead, Senator.
So how does this influence the fact that we just withdrew it from the Money Transmitters Act? I mean, if we're calling it legal tender now, are there other implications to the banking division that we need to consider? And I think based on the head shake, I think the answer is yes. This was not a problem when we were dealing with a little bit of gold and silver, but this is a bigger question. I think there's a lot more policy implications. Chris wants to say.
Go ahead, Mr. Land.
Yeah.
Crypto had to not be recognized
Right.
by the United States.
Mr. Chairman, but
Go ahead, Senator.
I'm curious. I'd like to hear from Director Faulkner about if he sees concerns. I'd love to hear from Revenue also what they're not here. So,
Commissioner, do you have anything you can contribute now, or would you like to at a later date? Understood, Commissioner.
yeah.
And I think that's probably one of the handy aspects of having a bill is
Sure, it's not a hard bill to draw,
Right.
so I'm not worried about that.
we will draw the eye, so to speak. So any other discussion? Everybody comfortable? All right, I'm gonna, so all those in favor of the motion, which is draft legislation in regards to making cryptocurrency a legal tender in the state of Wyoming, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, no. Motion carries. Mr. Land, what are we at, 2 now or 3? Well, committee, we got to get after it now. I think we had 15 in the corporations committee. That's a challenge. That is. Ms. Long, do you have another?
Mr. Chairman, may I propose another one? I thought that what Mr. Allen was saying was very interesting with regard to the concept of proofs in lieu of signatures sometimes being accepted and maybe superior. So I don't know enough about Wyoming's e-signature law to understand whether that might be something that should be expanded to reflect cryptographic proofs. But given what we've done with this technology in the state, it's probably worth reviewing while we're looking at whether we need to make legislative amendments. So I don't know enough yet to know what my motion would be, other than to say maybe for Administrator Moore and Mr. Allen, if you're so willing, to convene and make a recommendation at the October meeting. Is that too late, Mr. Chairman?
The October meeting would be way too late.
Okay.
Yeah, so basically, and just as a heads up for the task force and for the public, we've got this meeting and essentially the next meeting in Jackson to request drafted legislation. And then at the October meeting, we'll be finalizing that legislation. Then your chairman have to go and sell it to the rest of the legislative committees. So, yeah, we're under the gun.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, I would propose then that I saw a head nod that maybe there's a separate working group on this, because I know Mr. Allen has shared with me a concern about how it's written in House Bill 70, digital signatures is a little too narrow, and that cryptographic proofs might not actually be considered digital signatures. So it's possible that it falls into HB 70 redrafting, or it's possible that it falls into the e-signature law, but I feel like it's the appropriate time to consider this.
Mr. Land, is there a specific portion of our law that e-signature lands in?
4021.
Okay.
Really strike me as, so I would really value that, Mr. Allen.
So, Ms. Long, I'm going to guess that your motion is to draft legislation to update said act that Mr. Land brought up, and you will work with Mr. Allen in consultation to provide information to Mr. Land before the next meeting. Is that correct?
And with Administrator Moore, if you're willing as well. I saw a head nod. So yes, so
Yes.
move.
Is there a second?
Mr. Chairman, sorry.
I need a second.
Second.
Seconded by Mr. Pope. Okay, discussion. Go ahead, Senator.
Two things. The first is I'm putting my management council hat on for a minute and saying, let's be thoughtful about having LSO draft legislation. It takes a lot of work. So let's make sure we want the legislation. Let's make sure we know what it does. Let's make sure that we've got a sense of how much time and effort is going to go into it. We have far, far more committee meetings this year than we've ever had in the past, and we're short on attorneys. So there's my management council speech. Let's be cautious. All right, I'll take my management council hat off. Is this close enough or related enough to our smart contracts discussion that we should be dealing with this in a piece of legislation associated with smart contracts? Because I think it is. I think we're getting into the point where we want recognition of smart contracts, legal standing of smart contracts, and then we want to tie in better definitions of what that looks like in terms of the electronic signature and verification. So I think when we get to tomorrow's point 12, if we have a piece of legislation drafted associated with that, I think the electronic signature aspect that we're just discussing right now is going to be part of that and should be part of that. In fact, we should have them drafted at the same time. So those are my two thoughts, is that we should hold off. Again, let's be careful and not just draft everything we think of. And I do think this is an important topic, but we need to go through our point 12 tomorrow before I think we ask for that to be drafted and then have it drafted as one piece. That would be my recommendation, Mr. Chairman.
Any other?
Act like a senator.
Is there any other discussion?
Mr. Chairman, I think, thank you. Senator Rothfuss's point is well taken. And as I mentioned earlier, I think we're going to come across this in a few minutes in HB 70 as well. So procedurally, I'd be happy to withdraw this motion and roll it into the technical corrections if you think that from a management perspective, that's better. Okay, I withdraw the motion.
Does the second agree?
Agreed.
Okay. Mr. Kaufman, do you have a note?
No other comments, no.
Okay. Any other discussion?
Mr. Chairman.
Oh, go ahead,
Just
Representative
from
Olson.
a real practical sense of how to address this question, I think Mr. Land already looked at the Uniform Electronic Signature Act. I think all we really need to do is maybe put Mr. Land's head together with Mr. Allen's head and look at the definition of electronic signature in our act. And I mean, the way I read it from a lawyer's standpoint, I think it's extremely broad. But I'm looking at it right now. But maybe I'm missing something. And I think it's as simple as, at some point is to exchange an email, and Mr. Allen can weigh in on the technocrat side of what this definition looks like. And then Mr. Land could come back to us even by the September meeting and say, here's what Mr. Allen, said. And I'm volunteering you, Mr. Allen, I'm sorry. But that's what happens when you become the authority in the room.
You're ex officio on the task force now,
Exactly.
like Wyoming.
Yeah, definitely.
But I would like to address that issue in a broader sense than just HB 70, because what we're talking about is a future that's broader than smart contracts, that's broader than HB 70. And I want to make sure that our Electronic Signature Act is not archaic tomorrow. And maybe it's not. So I would just a little recommendation to LSO to bump heads with Mr. Allen and see what happens by September. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah. I don't know that
He
means.
nodded his head.
I think that's good enough.
Yeah.
So any further discussion in regards to outside jurisdictions? Seeing none, or Senator?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Are we going to, I was trying to find it, the financial sandbox concept. Would we be looking at banking amendments tomorrow for that? Is there another place that we're looking at having that discussion? Because I do think that's an interesting.
The banking amendments aspect is pretty wide open.
Okay.
In regard, that's not specific towards House Bill 70, although that's where the tussle started.
Okay.
That is definitely not limited down to just, and I would remind the task force that we are one of the few committees out there that Management Council did not put any parameters around where we go. As long as you can somehow point at blockchain at the end of the day, we're good to go.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, since it's statutory, Management Council doesn't get to talk about it.
Right.
That's the beauty of it.
Which I'll give a tip of the hat to Rep. Olson and Senator Rothfuss running a good amendment. So
I
you want to
think-
just handle that then?
I
Senator?
think that's probably a good time to handle that. So that'll do for there. And that was all I had this morning. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, committee, let's go ahead and bite into some real meat here. Secretary of State, Ms. Wheeler and Ms. James, would you join us to cover the House Bill 70 utility token bill and any kind of amendments? And this continues on the conversation that we started this morning in regards to our notice of filing, but a much broader term. And for the task force, for the individuals in the audience, and also for our YouTube crowd, when it comes to House Bill 70 utility token bills, the Wyoming legislature essentially built a wheelhouse. So the reason why we're looking at this again and looking at it closely is we were the first legislative body in the world to do what we did. And so as will happen, because we are all men and women, we will screw up. So we're going to look at this and kind of retread some of the ground we've already gone over and figure out any amendments we need to do to the grand scheme of the bill. So with that, Ms. James or Ms. Wheeler, which one's grabbing the wheel here?
Mr. Chairman, Kelly Janes, Secretary of State's office. I'll just start, if I could, with the fees. We did go over that just a little bit this morning. And I just wanted to inform you that currently our office does receive a filing fee of $200 for notice filings of securities that are preempted from state registration. So these are things such as mutual funds, Regulation D506 offerings. We also receive a $200 fee for exempt offerings such as crowdfunding, our Wyoming Invest Now, and Regulation A Tier 2 offerings. We do not receive a fee for securities that are exempt from registration, such as employee stock option plans, anything issued by a U.S. or foreign government, securities issued by banks, insurance companies, etc. So if a filing fee were implemented for this notice of intent, it may discourage the illegitimate forms that are being filed, but we would essentially be receiving a fee for something that, according to 17.4206, is not a security. So that just being said, I mean, you know, you're the policymakers on the fee, but we just wanted to put that out there regarding the fee.
Is it your belief that that $200 filing fee in regards to a utility ICO would discourage those type of erroneous filings that you've received, the picnic basket, so to speak?
I believe so, Mr. Chairman. However, you know, it's possible that we could get a bad check. We wouldn't know it until after it's bounced. Also, you know, we have clearly only 10 filed, and we have thousands of them happening at any given time, and those aren't being filed with us. So then do we have any enforcement for those that aren't filing their fee, that aren't filing their form? So it does get to be a little bit problematic.
Mr. Chairman?
Go ahead, Senator.
That actually raises two questions, though. The first is, would you have the authority, it sounds like by statute, you don't feel like you would have the authority to put a fee on this filing, a $50 fee, a $25 fee?
Mr. Chairman, Senator, I don't believe we do without statutory, unless we want to put it into rule.
Mr. Chairman, that was actually my question. I was curious whether you can do it by rule, whether I'm not familiar enough with the statutes to know whether you have the authority to come up with your own fee structure if it's not established in statute. It sounds like you don't feel that statute covers what we're talking about, which makes perfect sense based on what you read. So I'm curious whether you have statutory authority that you gain from somewhere else that would allow you through rule to put a $25 fee on.
Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, go ahead.
Senator, all of our fees throughout the Uniform Securities Act are set by statute, every single one. We do have broad rulemaking authority in that act. So I believe that we potentially could. However, this is kind of getting into, we're regulating something that you're saying is not a security, and we are attaching a fee to it.
Yeah, go ahead, Rep. Olson. You got a good point.
Oh, I'm just trying to, okay, so I'm trying to wrap my head around that statement. I thought I heard you say that we charge a $200 filing fee for the win for the crowdfunding, which the whole idea of that, if I understand it right, is, I mean, it's essentially an exemption just the same, right? Or is it by definition treated as a security, even though it's an exemption?
Mr. Chairman, Representative, yes, it's absolutely a security. This is a securities offering that is happening. It's just exempt from registration with us. So our crowdfunding offerings are securities. They are offering equity securities.
Ms. Long.
Mr. Chairman, I think the legislature saw fit to have the Secretary of State enforce the fraud provisions from the securities laws to utility tokens, even though they are exempt from the securities laws, which is a little bit of a mind bender as well. So there's a little bit of a precedent that we are borrowing something from the securities laws already.
Right.
I think we're going to be talking in a little bit whether we want to keep that drafting, whether to do it as an exemption, whether to keep it as an exemption from securities laws or separate it out as digital property. But I just wanted to point out there is precedent. We have borrowed from the security statute already, even though we've exempted them.
Yeah.
Right.
And
Go ahead, Rep.
Mr. Chairman, also what's confusing is that the Securities Division of the Secretary of State's office is the one you are actually regulating this, right? You are. So even though we're not calling it a security, the Securities Division of the Secretary of State's office is in fact the division of the office that is in fact regulating it.
Mr. Chairman, I think I could answer that one.
Go ahead, Mr. Coffin.
So in the securities context, when you file, like what they were referencing, a Regulation D exemption, our Secretary of State doesn't necessarily regulate that offering or that exemption. The Federal Securities and Exchange Commission regulates that. So we're just filing a notice filing with our Secretary of State saying, hey, we're complying with this exemption. Here's our filing fee. We're putting you on notice that we're doing this, but there's nothing for you to do unless you find something wrong. I think the same could be said of the House Bill 70. It's just the onus is on the filer to file an exemption notice with them to say, hey, we're doing this. It's a notice filing. It's not subjecting yourself to the authority of the office. It's simply a notice filing so that we know that it's happening. And in that context, when you're doing, for example, a Regulation D offering, you have to file a notice filing in every state where your investors reside and pay this fee in every state where your investors reside, not just once. So I'm just bringing that up because I think it's kind of the cost of doing business. It's the norm for the industry that when you're going to go do an offering and make that offering in a state, you're going to pay some type of an exemption fee.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman.
All right, go ahead, Senator.
With the current statutory language, what happens if I do create a utility token and don't file with you? How would you find out? What would you do about it? I didn't have to pay a fee. Would there be a penalty associated with me not paying the fee? But I didn't have to pay.
Mr. Chairman, Senator, as far as I understand it, we would only take action if it is a security and not a utility token. So if it's a utility token, as defined now, we would not be able to take action unless there's some sort of fraud.
However, Mr. Chairman, under our current act, one of the ways that you get exempted from securities law is by filing this notice. If you don't file the notice, you presumably don't meet the exemption.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So, Mr. Chairman, I guess if that's a requirement, I don't know how that's not regulation, but I guess we're saying it's regulation. It's just not regulation of the security, and that's why the statutory provision doesn't apply because it explicitly says regulation of the security. Is that right?
Ms. James.
Mr. Chairman, I believe so. Yes, Senator.
Got it. Okay.
I think it's also important to note that these quote unquote utility ICOs, this is the most heavily regulated they are anywhere in the United States.
It's true.
In the state of Wyoming. I mean, granted, nobody else has any regulations written on them, but I mean, that does make us the most heavily regulated. So
Some libertarian.
Some libertarian, right? And I think that about covers it for the filing aspect. So Ms. James, if you want to continue on, unless anybody else has any more questions in regards to the filing fee? No? Okay, Ms. James.
Mr. Chairman, and that was part of our discussions in our office too, is do we just get rid of this form? Because now we are filing a form to say that they're not going to do anything. They're going to file a form so they don't have to file a form. So that's something we want to talk down the road too as well, is are we the appropriate agency to be filing this form with? And I know the intent of the form was that if this does go south, then we do have a name, we have that kind of a thing. But you know, if we decide to attach a fee to it, I don't know that we'll see more. I don't know that we'll see less. But as you said, if they're supposed to be filing this form, clearly they're not, if we have only 10 filed so far. Just something to consider. I'll go on, Mr. Chairman, to some possible amendments to some other things that we have looked at in our office. We're still struggling with, of course, with the, you know, this is intrastate only. It's a little bit conflicting with federal law, and we do feel that if some language was added regarding that the token itself has to be in existence at the time of the sale. This may take away that prong of the Howey test where you're depending on the efforts of others. Because if it's already in existence, then you're not waiting for the efforts of others. So that's just something we would like the task force to consider, the committee to consider an amendment. However, I do know that the committee may have your own amendments that we would love to hear. And maybe one of them might even be removing this out of our Securities Act completely. So if that's the case, we wouldn't necessarily need this amendment, perhaps, but we would want to know what's going forward. Also, along with that, the token is exchangeable for the stated good, service, or content at the time of the sale. And so those are just some things that we have come up with just looking at the definition of an investment contract. And
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead, Senator.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On that last point, if it's the free beer every day for a year, I can't exchange that for its value that day because the value is the coin over the year. And those types of concepts are part of what the utility token is supposed to be able to encompass. That's still not an investment. I mean, I'm not, but it actually probably fails the test you're talking about from the standpoint of I do need somebody to make that beer in the future and serve it to me at some point in the future, and it's not a today kind of thing. So how do you remedy that suggestion with those types of concepts where even if it's not an appreciating asset or an investment, it's still not a today thing. It's a future thing that I'm buying today.
Ms. Chance.
Mr. Chairman, Senator, as far as so in that example, if you were to give your money and receive the token, but not receive your beer, then the token would already be in existence. It's the token that's created.
Okay, so for the first, just having it exist, but the last statement was more the concern.
I believe our conversations went around the fact that the asset can be bought and sold on a secondary market and potentially make it exempt, I believe is the. So, and this is up for discussion, Mr. Chairman, members, but just we're trying to wrap our heads around this since it's only been 2 months.
Sure.
And we definitely still see some issues with investment contract.
Mr. Chairman, on that point, you don't want the possibility of resale? I mean, I can have resale of an object that is not a security and is, again, not an appreciating object. I can be selling it for its even depreciated value off of the original. Again, going to my 365 days of beer, it would be rational for me to sell it halfway through for half the value.
Ms. Chance. I think I can help on that one if you'd like. In regards to the legislation, this is in everybody's handout. If you turn to page 2 of the enrolled act, it goes through the aspects that make it a utility token, specifically items 3 and 4 under B. 3, if the token does not have a consumptive purpose available at the time of sale, so there's no consumptive purpose exactly at that moment, then the initial buyer of the token is prevented from reselling the token until the token is available for use for a consumptive purpose, or, and this is 4, the developer or seller takes other reasonable precautions to prevent buyers from purchasing the token as a financial investment. So I think along those lines, it is a preventative aspect. However, how you prevent that is anybody's guess.
Right, Mr. Chairman, but the concerns that the Secretary of State's office and the Securities Division is presenting go beyond this, and that's what I'm looking for, is how we can try to address those concerns without ruining some of the value of this utility token prospect, where again it is exchangeable. That's one of the concepts here, that it can be traded in the future. It's just not supposed to be an appreciating financial investment. So, do you see the conflict there with kind of the concerns you raised?
Mr. Chairman, Senator, yes, we do. I think having it in existence at the time of the sale is something more of a priority to us.
Ms. Long, I'm going to call on you.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, that would align Wyoming's law more closely with where the SEC's head is. So I think that's, Ms. James, is that where the recommendation is coming from, that it would align Wyoming law more with federal securities law and reduce the potential for conflict?
Mr. Chairman, Ms. Long, this is not coming from the SEC by any means, but yes, that is the intent.
Mr. Chairman?
Go ahead, Senator.
I'm struggling to understand really when you say as long as the token existed at the time, but the beer, going back to the beer example, but the beer doesn't have to. What would a counter example in that instance be? How would it not exist at that time?
Mr. Chairman, Senator,
Ms. James.
so a lot of these notice of intents that we're seeing show on their website token coming soon. And so there's really no, there's still this promise out there that you're depending on the efforts of others.
Okay, so Mr. Chairman, following up on that. So it really is just the fact that they haven't actually done the work to create the utility token. It's not even what the utility token represents that you're concerned about. It's nobody's actually created the utility token yet that is the concern. And you want that utility token to exist before they identify it as not being a security.
Mr. Chairman, Senator, with a defined purpose, yes.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, so final follow-up there then.
Go ahead.
So you want to make sure that you know its purpose is set because the token exists with a specific purpose, and that's what you want to be able to put up against these B provisions here and say, all right, it meets those.
Mr. Chairman, Senator, yes, and that kind of goes along with 17.4206B3, which states that the person takes reasonably prompt action to terminate the exchange of the token that does not conform to requirements of this subsection, which we would ask to be deleted, because at this point, if they file this notice of intent, they can create whatever they want, raise capital for it, and then all of a sudden they decide, whoa, we're doing a security, then all of a sudden they can just terminate it and our hands are tied.
Ms. James, can you remind me? I thought that was, I thought that little portion, the person takes reasonably prompt action to terminate the exchange of the token that does not conform to the requirements of the subsection. I thought, was that amended in? I can't remember. Or was that our original part of the legislation? Yeah, it was amended in. I thought that was a.
Mr. Chairman, I don't quite remember, but I believe that it was there from the beginning.
Well, we're gonna have to, yeah, we're gonna have to arm wrestle.
I'd have to look.
Thank you, Mr. Land. Well, and that's regardless of it. So your belief is that that portion needs to come out because it provides a window of opportunity where someone can abuse this?
From our perspective, yes, Mr. Chairman. Could be.
Hope everybody's taking notes.
With that, Mr. Chairman, we'd just like to hear what the committee would like to do for amendments to House Bill 70 or amendments to the Securities Act.
Right. So I'm going to kind of kick the football here real quick before I hand it off. So one of the aspects that I think is really important that this committee does, and it's going to be a big undertaking, but I would like to extract all of this from the Uniform Security Act and put it under its own title/chapter, however you want to do it there, Mr. Land. But I do believe it deserves its own place, separate from the Uniform Security Act, and that way we can specifically lay down our fraud statutes and label them out instead of referencing other statutes, and that there's no confusion. I mean, because at the end of the day, we're exempting it from securities, and it's in the Uniform Security Act. So it is a little cumbersome in that regard. I don't feel bad about that at all, because realistically, we're building a wheel here, so this is going to be a learning process. Anyways, committee. Mr. Kaufman?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I just had a question. Ms. James, do you have any, opinions, I guess, at this point about the fact that a lot of these, well, most of the filings, it looks like, have come from out-of-state companies? And I guess the reason for my question in that is I've counseled, a couple dozen companies now on potential offerings, and I'm telling everybody this could only be utilized as an intrastate exemption. And under 3A11 to be an intrastate exemption, you got to be a Wyoming company and be offering a Wyoming token. So sorry, but if you're a Chicago company and you want to roll out a Wyoming token, I'm telling people I don't think you can do that legally. So I'm just curious if you have opinions about that, because I need to get it straight in my own head probably.
Ms. James.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Kaufman, that's exactly what we feel as well. And we don't provide legal advice, but at the same time, we are basically telling them that's how we understand it as well, and that to seek legal advice. If they are not a Wyoming company and they are not offering this in just Wyoming, then they need to tread lightly, because that is the issue that we're seeing as well.
Ms. James, did we have any organization that filed a notice of intent that didn't file an LLC or a corporation?
Mr. Chairman, yes.
Okay.
So, Mr. Chairman, I just want to make this general comment to the committee then, just for consideration. I don't want to create more limitations than necessary to have this exemption utilized, but just an observation in my own practice has been, there have been a lot of companies that have called wanting to figure out how they do a Wyoming token offering. When I tell them you need to be a Wyoming company, for some of them that ends the conversation. And so I'm almost looking at it from the standpoint of, I wonder if there's a requirement that you be a Wyoming company, if that's an impediment or a reason for them to be here again. Maybe not, and maybe that's too far reaching for the statute, but I just want to throw that out there, that I think it's a really important distinction under the Federal Securities Act to maintain that intrastate exemption, and it's a big topic.
Mr. Chairman?
Go ahead, Senator.
I'm just curious more about that, and maybe Matt can talk a little bit more about it, or maybe the Secretary of State's office, but why are we doing it that way? Why are we having it so that you have to be a Wyoming corporation if what we're saying basically is that we're not regulating this as a security? I mean, if that's the statement we're making, and then we're saying, but whoa, you have to be a Wyoming corporation to create this entity that we're not regulating. I honestly don't understand that.
So,
Mr. Kaufman.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman. So, I mean, the simple analysis is the second you, as a company, an issuer, as you're defined under the Securities Exchange Act, the second you're an issuer and you sell a security across state lines, so you're engaged in interstate commerce, you're now under the jurisdiction of the Securities Exchange Commission. So what we've done in this piece of legislation is say, first of all, if you do these things, you're not a security, right? And second of all, we only have jurisdiction authority over what happens in Wyoming. The second someone offers that token or that coin outside of Wyoming, we have no control over what that regulation is. So I'm counseling clients that in order to truly avoid the interstate commerce aspect, which invokes necessarily the SEC, you have to maintain Wyoming residency and sell it within Wyoming. So you got to be a Wyoming company. This exemption, this interested exemption, is known as 3A11. Under that definition, and granted, I'm using the securities definition and placing it onto a token application here, but under that definition, you have to be a Wyoming company, and your purchasers all have to be Wyoming residents. Otherwise, you lose that exemption.
Right.
Senator.
Mr. Chairman, but it's a little bit of the catch-22 from the standpoint of we're saying in Wyoming, these are not considered by the state of Wyoming to be securities. And you demonstrate that. But then we're going to rely on all of these securities statutes, and both federally and within the state, to govern that. So I guess I don't know how we can have it both ways, or whether we should have it both ways. And maybe I understand why you would certainly do that, because you don't want to get anyone crosswise with the SEC, and you're being conservative. But I mean, just both philosophically and maybe from the standpoint of what we can do, where we're in cloudy territory right now with regard to what the SEC direction is going to be. Do we want to be able to allow, I mean, would our objective be to let anyone from anywhere in the country file a token in the state of Wyoming and have that be allowed and have the statutes cover them? I don't know if we talked that through.
Yeah, go ahead,
just a
Mr.
quick observation. I believe that's a matter between attorney and client, whether or not they recommend that it be a Wyoming corporation. And since we are exempting it, I understand what our Senator Rothfuss is saying, that if we're exempting it, we have no reason to tell them how they should structure it, except what we provided as the rules for exemption. And so I'm not inclined to agree that we should vote into the exemption a requirement that they be a Wyoming corporation.
I do think it's something important to note is that the other state that did identify utility exemptions, or this utility exemption, Arizona, did throw in something that we don't have in our law. Now, granted, I believe our law is far superior to Arizona all day, every day. However, there is this one clause that makes theirs, that's a little bit nicer. And that, I don't know that it's even legal. Well, I guess it's legal, it's in their law books, but what they did state was that any other state that followed like regulatory framework as a utility exemption shall be essentially an economic zone as part of the sale of ICOs. I don't know that that's entirely legal. However, I think it's in their statute, so I think it has to be.
Mr. Chairman, that's exactly what I was going to comment on to both of the points made down there. I mean, I liken this to marijuana laws at this point, right? Just because it's legal in Colorado, the second you come up here with it, it's not necessarily legal. That being said, the more states that begin to adopt a regulatory framework for that and accept it, that there becomes an ability to transact. So I really like actually what Arizona did in that standpoint. All I'm suggesting is I'm seeing a lot of people not utilizing the Wyoming exemption offering because they're not comfortable with how they get to a path of unregulated status from the SEC. And so what I'm suggesting is if we more tightly define the intrastate exemption, I think it's a greater enticement for companies to do that. I mean, the promise here is not that companies are going to, unless, I mean, there are companies every day that are filing for no action letters from the SEC and would like to use Wyoming as a testing ground and then roll it out to other states, right? That's a really popular model right now. I just want them to start here in Wyoming and do it first. And then as other states begin to enact similar enabling legislation, they can roll it out. And what I'm seeing right now, at least in a lot of the companies that I'm talking to, is they're not comfortable that really this exemption creates them much more protection. It certainly doesn't create any more protection from the SEC. So why bother filing anything with the Secretary of State's office? Let's just go do it wherever we're going to do it.
Mr. Chairman?
Yeah, go ahead, Mr. Pope.
Oh,
Ms. Long.
Sorry, Ms. Long. just to the Arizona issue, the Arizona Attorney General actually reached out to me and asked if there were a way we could facilitate reciprocity with them. And I said that I would bring it up, so consider it brought up.
Yeah, Mr. Lynn.
The notice, I guess, that we know a lot of the Commerce Clause of the U.S. Constitution, whether it is states can enact acts. We're walking right up to that one. It would certainly be worthy of some more research. But once you start enacting state legislation that across the state line, it's very tricky.
You're suggesting we might get a nasty gram from the federal government?
You know, they can do whatever they want. So
Yeah.
Maybe. Yeah. Maybe.
I don't like that.
Mr. Chairman?
Yeah, go ahead, Senator. Actually, I had Ms.
Yeah,
Long next.
that's
I'm
right.
sorry,
Please
Senator.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think this is a really fruitful discussion, but it's also worth reminding everyone that the federal issues are not under our control, and they are clear as mud right now.
Mm-hmm.
So the SEC may determine that everything in this industry is a security, in which case, frankly, unfortunately, what we've done doesn't really help with attracting business to Wyoming. What our stated purpose is, though, is to attract business to Wyoming. So that's why we suggested earlier potentially engaging on the federal issues, because it's very clear the SEC is walking things back from their earlier statement where everything was black and white and everything is a security. We don't know where they're going to land.
Right.
So I think it's hard for us to game that out at this point, because it is going to take a couple of years, realistically. There is an effort in Congress to define a utility token, and I always point everyone to what Wyoming passed, because even though it's not perfect in terms of how it fits within the federal securities laws, because it doesn't have that 1-year exemption like Reg D does, for example. It doesn't have, I know the SEC wants the utility tokens to actually be exchangeable before they can be a utility token. That may be where the SEC lands, but we don't know that yet. So it's worth noting that trying to game the SEC at this point is a futile exercise, because we don't know where they're going to land. And I'd rather, given what we passed, hold that up and say, SEC, this is what works, because we've had so many companies tell us, to your point, and David's point as well, the 3 civilians on this committee all have direct experience with companies telling us they're leaving the United States, and that Wyoming was their last chance of keeping their business in the United States.
Senator, did you want to?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I was just curious about the idea of this being intrastate and where we rub up against the Commerce Clause. And maybe Mr. Coffin can explain what he's been advising people. If I'm selling, let's say I do everything right from forming my company in Wyoming, creating my utility token in Wyoming, what happens if I then sell token out to folks that are not Wyoming residents? Is that something that's going to be acceptable because of commerce or in spite of commerce, or what are the implications there?
Mr. Chairman, Senator, that's a great question. I don't know that I can answer that question. I can tell you that the general rule of thumb in securities laws is where the purchaser resides is always the law that governs. So, well, I shouldn't say always, but most of the time, the law that governs. So the second you sell a token to residents of New York, you better be concerned about what New York's laws are with respect to that. So unless there's an exemption path, I think there has to be consideration. But I don't, quite frankly, I haven't even ever gotten that far in the conversation. I'm just trying to get somebody to launch one of these things and do it in an intrastate manner that I think is exempt to get one rolling. So I don't know that I've really thought that far ahead.
Thanks.
Mr. Chairman, you're absolutely right, Mr. Kaufman, that that securities laws work that way. But I think where Chairman Lindholm was going and where I would concur is that maybe the better way to have done this and an opportunity for us to amend is to pull this out of securities laws, because we're saying it's not a security, and put it in property law. Property law is very clearly the purview of the states. It is governed by the Uniform Commercial Code. And if we stake out that territory that this is a new form of property, then federal securities laws may not apply. Now, every other state, in theory, would have to adopt that, but we're giving a better, probably a stronger legal defense for someone who issues a utility token in Wyoming that this is not a security, because under Wyoming law it would be property, not a security.
Got it. What title is that, Chris? The 35? No, 35 is hell.
43.
Okay.
34.
Mr. Chairman, just one more quick thing. On the interstate commerce, you don't need any exemptions if it's personal property being sold across states, across state lines.
Correct.
Mr. Chairman, those are fair comments. I'm just operating under the assumption that the SEC has thus far deemed everything to be a security. So we have to find a securities exemption for the most part for these companies to, in a de-risked manner, make these offerings.
Right. And I think that's a fair point. Now, it's also important to note that the SEC has only gone after, I mean, realistically, fraud. And the only time we've ever heard anything in regards to the SEC thinking that every ICO they've seen is a security has been rolled back, or at least dialed back by Jay Clayton. So I think that's realistically what we're going off of here, folks, is side comments from commissioners. I mean, we've got nothing serious or of substance from the SEC in this regard. But that is why I think, and everybody here, I think, believes that it's important that the SEC comes to the table with Wyoming in this regard, because we're clearly, and we'll get to public testimony in a bit. Thank you. So Ms. Long?
May I add one more comment? One of the reasons why I'm convinced, as someone who spent 22 years in the securities industry, that the SEC has to change the regulation is the absurdity that results if you take it to the extreme that every one of these utility tokens is a security. That means that you need to have a Charles Schwab account to use your Starbucks coin to pay for a cup of coffee. And what if Charles Schwab decides not to integrate with a blockchain? Effectively, what you've done is given the securities industry the right to kill this entire industry in the United States. So this is a couple of years down the road, because as the Secretary of State's office testified, most of these are not actually trading tokens yet. That's this issue is coming to a head once a lot of these things that were registered in Reg D form that are not actually trading yet actually become tradable. In other words, the coins are actually exchangeable for goods and services, and that forces the SEC to take this issue head on, which is that normal securities, regular traditional securities, are exchangeable for one thing and one thing only, and that's cash. Utility tokens are exchangeable for either cash or goods and services. They're fundamentally different than securities in that simple regard, and the SEC has said nothing about that yet, which makes me convinced they have to say something about this. This industry is now too big. As we talked about it earlier, it's 40% of the size of the IPO market in the first quarter. So it's hard for me on this task force to recommend that we try to skate to where the puck is going to be, because we have no idea where this is all going to play out.
I do think we'll have a better idea too at the Jackson meeting. The SEC has indicated that they will try to attend that one, along with some of their federal family, to include the Federal Reserve and the CFTC. And I just really wanted to say federal family, so I apologize. Yeah, I do think they like to go to Jackson. Well, who doesn't like to go to Jackson? Yeah, everybody likes to go to Jackson. I guess, Ms. Janes, is there anything else in regards to House Bill 70 before we start to go into public testimony and or working the legislation? And by the way, when we do go to work the legislation and bring amendments, I am going to ask that you stay at the table, because we will be relying on you.
Mr. Chairman, no, we were here to talk investor protection as well. Is that?
Oh, yeah,
are
go
we
ahead.
Doing that now?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, I'm going to turn it over to the deputy.
Okay, Ms. Wheeler?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the task force, Karen Wheeler, Deputy Secretary of State. Thank you for the great conversation. I think you now see the challenges that we've had with the implementation of this bill and the different perceptions of the intent of this bill. So we do appreciate the conversation, and we do appreciate all the thoughts and ideas that you do have. So as you know from all of the conversation, our office is responsible for the regulation of the investment industry. And what some of you may not know is that also encompasses your stockbrokers, your brokerage firms, your investment advisors, and your investment advisor representatives, as well as various investments. It's a whole big gamut. And it is also our responsibility to help ensure that our Wyoming citizens do not become the victim of investment fraud. And I will just put the caveat out there right now. I am very passionate about this topic. I have spent the last 20 of my 33 years in the Secretary of State's office in the investigation and the prosecution of investment fraud. And you would be amazed what investment fraud exists in Wyoming and what we've prosecuted. It doesn't matter what laws are on the books. These people that perpetrate the fraud are incredibly creative and convincing. And we've had many of our Wyoming citizens lose their entire retirement, lose their homes, lose everything they have due to investment fraud. And so with this new territory that we're coming into, I am asking for your help. I know this is going to bring a new dimension to the type of fraud that we investigate. And it's bringing a dimension in which right now, we don't have that specialized skill set that this will take. We are experts in the traditional forms that we see of investment fraud, but this is bringing a new dimension. And so we are asking for your support because we will be requesting funding so that we can do a contract to bring on someone that has the specialized skill set that we're going to need to investigate these frauds. Some of them are already out there. We are seeing a lot of advertisements that are encouraging people to convert their IRAs, their retirements into certain crypto products that companies have, and they are guaranteeing 163% profit or higher. Now, we all know if it's too good to be true, it's not. So we're seeing this out there. We don't want any of our Wyoming citizens to lose their retirements to a scam like this. But right now, we don't have the staff nor the expertise to start going after this. So we're just asking for your support when we go and request additional funding. We want to bring someone on a contract basis right now. And the reason we're doing a contract, and we've done this before when we've had to bring in experts, is fraud doesn't have a timeline nor a set schedule. We don't know when someone's going to come to us when they've lost their entire savings. So we would like to do it on a contract basis so we have that person available when something comes up. And we're very proactive. We do investor education programs. Kelly and I have traveled from one end of this state to the other doing programs. We do realize with this new territory comes a whole different type of educational program that we are working on right now. And so we are going to revamp our program so we can reach our new target audience and reach them in ways that we don't typically reach our traditional investors.
Any questions? Ms. Wheeler, in regards to support, so I envision one of two things happening, and I agree that your securities division does need someone on board. Now, even with moving this legislation to the property title, because the trigger on House Bill 70 happens when they don't complete one of those 4 tasks, they're considered a security. I do still think it's appropriate that remain in your office. I don't know how you feel about that, but my opinion is I do believe that it's appropriate. For lack of a better idea, anywhere else to go. I mean, you guys are pretty much the only ones with that experience. So that being the case, we've got one of two options in regards to this at-will employee, this contract employee. We either go to a supplemental budget request with you, or we do a draft piece of legislation. And I think in prior conversations that we've had, a draft piece of legislation is going to be far more successful in that regards for that one at-will. And I was wondering, do you have any ideas on what that would look like?
Mr. Chairman, thank you. So first of all, I do want to clarify, it's not going to be an at-will employee.
Oh, pardon me.
So when we have done this before, particularly when we were short-staffed and we needed to do audits of firms across the state, we entered into a contract with former SEC auditors and used them on an as-needed basis. Mm-hmm. That's what we're looking at here, not an AWAC employee.
Okay.
Just someone we contract with to use on an as-needed basis to start with.
Yeah.
Until we get a feel for what's out there, and if we need to then bring it on in a more full-time position. So that's what we're looking for.
I think what we might be able to do in that regard is when we do the redraft of House Bill 70, we can have like a section 4 or something that gives the Secretary of State's office authority to use their 900 series to leverage that.
And Mr. Chairman,
go ahead, Senator.
If we do end up providing some nominal fees for some of these things that we didn't put any fees on, we can actually just funnel that into the 900 series.
Right.
Yeah, and I think that's probably the best way. So there's not even an additional appropriation, just give you the authorization based on the assumption that new revenue will come in.
Yeah, unless only 5. We only have enough 5
right.
So we might want to put a little seed money there.
Right. Well, Mr. Chairman, it's not just this, but we were talking about for the filings of the series LLC, for some other things, we probably need to look at the filing fee structure and maybe even the electronic filings associated with blockchains. There's a lot that we can do. Yeah. So.
Yeah, no.
We'll associate there 3 a day, so that's going to be substantial.
Yeah, right, yeah.
We headed down the right path? They're in agreement, Ms. Wheeler?
Mr. Chairman, yes, you are. And as to the mechanism for which you fund it, I certainly leave that up to your discretion. I just do appreciate your support. I do know that based on my 100 years in the Secretary of State's office, fraud's not going to go away, but we want to do everything we can to
I'm going to hop in. What do you think if we raised LLC fees, filing fees to fund that?
Mr. Chairman, that is certainly a topic that we are having with the Corporations Committee.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead, Senator.
We're not discussing it yet, but we had the conversation obviously about working on the database structure, working on the system, which is going to be a multi-million-dollar project realistically.
Yeah.
And if we do have different obligations, we've got an update of a database system, then something will have to change. And it could be the fee structure, it could be a direct appropriation, but my sense is that the legislature is going to be less excited about direct appropriation than it would be about looking at a fee structure that's going to compensate for the increased cost. That would certainly be my expectation.
And Mr. Chairman,
go ahead, Ms. Wheeler.
Because this is falling within the realm of investments only, that's the only kind of fraud that we will be investigating. Right now, we have a securities enforcement fund that is funded by stockbroker fees, and all we need is spending authority granted to expand our 900 series just enough for a contract.
Well, and I guess to add on to that, or at least as another option too, is a possibility is more of a keep authority in regards to a lot of your fees taken in on LLCs, those types of things could help. In my opinion, you can correct me if I'm wrong, could help your office expand more on these LLC issues and further this kind of situation if you did have, instead of tipping over directly to the general fund?
Mr. Chairman, that certainly would help. And as you know, and members of the committee know, every penny our office brings in, And we do generate, we're projected to generate 48 million this biennium. It goes directly to the general fund. So certainly retainage of a portion of that would be useful.
Any other comments, committee? Not seeing any. Ms. Wheeler, any other comments before we move to public testimony?
No, Mr. Chairman, I don't. Thank you very much.
Stay close. Any public testimony in regards to going into House Bill 70? I will state to the public that we'll probably, my guess anyways, is we'll probably be going into our second meeting with a fresh piece of title. And that will probably be the time to bring amendments at that point is my guess. But either way, public testimony, Mr. Kramer. Even though I know your name, you got to restate it at the mic. Sorry. Yeah.
Hi, Kevin Kramer with Mito Play. Very interesting conversation there earlier. You know, there's a couple things we've been doing. We are planning an ICO. We're looking at where to do that internationally, where to do it domestically. We're working closely with Perkins Coie, who is the law firm with about 40 attorneys in a cryptocurrency practice. They're leading that working group along with Union Square Ventures, Andreessen Horowitz, and McDermott, Will, and Emery, as well as Cooley, to draft the safe harbor recommendation to the SEC that was sent in the end of March, which we have a copy of. It's one of their clients. I would have a question. Has anyone in the committee been in touch with that Silicon Valley working group? Because if not, I could try to facilitate an introduction. The partner at Perkins Coie, who's responsible for this, they've got a lot of, you know, private industry. We got venture capitalists and lawyers trying to guide the SEC on what we want to do. It might help you guys to be involved in that, as well as a state stepping up saying we want to participate in this utility token safe harbor. The memo is basically recommended to the SEC that they create a safe harbor for utility tokens. The language in the memo reflects a lot of what House Bill 70 also reflects around consumptive nature of it. Senator Ross was here about the beer club. They talked about a voucher to buy a Tesla before the Tesla was released. Is that a security? Is that not a security? That's mentioned in the memo. So would it be beneficial for this committee to be connected? And if so, who would be the lead to connect to Perkins Coie to kind of be the voice of Wyoming into that working group around utility tokens?
So my opinion, committee, is we've obviously got some experience on the task force. However, it would be correct me if I'm wrong, if you'd rather handle it a different way. I'd rather send a letter to these individuals, invite them to come and participate, unless anyone of you would like to volunteer to be that point man. Mr. Kaufman would.
Yeah,
Okay,
Mr. Chairman, I am actually really interested because I'd love to get a handle on what information they're giving to the SEC. Because I know the ultimate goal here is to get this away from the securities discussion, but at least in the short term, it's not away from the securities discussion. So knowing how they're trying to craft an exemption recommendation, I think would be super fascinating. So I would be really interested in that.
There's our guy.
There we go.
Mr. Chairman,
Ms. Long?
They did not reach out to us. The SEC has, however, directly reached out to me twice. It's once late last year and once literally while I was sitting in the Capitol building in Wyoming. And there are multiple efforts underway. So I don't know whether this Silicon Valley effort is going to have a greater impact than any of the other efforts. There's the Digital Asset Trade Association is working on something. There's the Token Alliance of the Digital Chamber of Commerce. So it's clear as mud. So yes, we should definitely participate. But I would just caution the committee that the task force that we don't know that that is ultimately going to be where the industry lands, because there are so many different groups trying to work on this at the same time with the SEC. And the SEC is essentially saying nothing right now.
Mr. Chairman and the committee, I do agree with that. I also think the direction you have on looking at this as property and then possibly taking it out is the direction that may end up just getting it completely clear of the security discussion. Coming back to a couple of the comments that were happening on the tokens and the token existing or not, the earlier discussion, I think Senator Rothfuss, you were talking about, you know, what a lot of companies are looking at is token utility. The token, you can make a token tomorrow that doesn't do anything, or you can make a token tomorrow that has utility that can actually be done. So the The idea of it not being a security is when it has utility. You can actually use it for something. You can use it for the defined purpose in the white paper that prevents 3 guys from writing a white paper and raising a bunch of money for something that has no usefulness. So a utility token has to have utility, which is usefulness under the law. So it's just a data point to provide up. Token utility is a big buzzword, and people we're talking to quite a bit, that it has to not just be utility token, but it has to have utility at the time of a public sale.
Right.
And then a question I have for the committee,
Go ahead.
talking about the intrastate. I thought that, House Bill 70 and the intrastate implications of this being pretty big. And Mr. Kaufman, you're mentioning that it's where the purchaser resides. But if the purchaser had an LLC in Wyoming that were making the purchase, would that then all be considered an intrastate transaction? Because that might be an interesting way to bring both token issuers and token purchasers into Wyoming, and that the issuer is a Wyoming LLC and the purchaser is a Wyoming LLC, in which case it's a Wyoming transaction.
Well, Mr. Chairman, so I'm not giving the group legal advice here, but I'm
writing it down.
That is a potential workaround that's been discussed. I don't know whether or not that would ultimately hold up, but that is a potential workaround.
Because Senator Ross, that ties into your thing of you guys trying to draw people in, draw in more LLCs, more investment, more development opportunities, and for utility token sales, for token issuers, if they knew they had a way to issue a token in Wyoming, they knew they had a way to sell that token in Wyoming to Wyoming LLCs that might not be Wyoming residents with Wyoming LLCs, that might give them an additional sense of protection and desire and draw to come to Wyoming for their issuance of the tokens.
Seeing no further questions, thank you, Mr. Kramer.
Thank you.
Any other, Mr. Jennings? And once again, also, you got to restate your name for the record, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Rob Jennings. And my question is for Deputy Wheeler. And I was just interested, I'm hearing this concept of sort of a roving at call, we won't call him at will, on call SEC investigator that the Secretary of State's office is looking to hire. My question would be, what would trigger that guy going out and doing an audit on an ICO? What's the trigger point there? And is this a full audit that this all seems to be kind of like something new that was, my understanding of the bill was that if there was somebody that fell out of line with the utility token, it would be referred to the Attorney General's office. Is there a new layer of bureaucracy being added here, or a new layer of scrutiny that the ICO people might not be aware of? That would be my only question, just some clarification.
I think Ms. Long wants to take a poke here.
Sure, I'll turn it to Deputy Wheeler, but at the request of the Secretary of State during the HB 70 process, the securities fraud standards were applied to ICOs. So it's clear the Secretary of State is already has the jurisdiction to pursue this, and it's a matter of resource availability. Is that correct, Mr. Chairman and Deputy Wheeler?
Mr. Chairman, Ms. Long, and Mr. Jennings, what we're talking about has nothing to do with ICOs that we regulate or don't regulate. The investment schemes that we see are for investments that are non-existent. Mm-hmm. Railroad bonds, gold bonds, wind farms.
Wait, time out. Railroad bonds aren't real.
Some of the old ones.
Darn it.
Let me put it this way. They're not as valuable as they were pitched for. Non-existent wind farms. These type of investment schemes that don't fall under what you have defined in House Bill 70. And we're not asking for an auditor. That was my example that we have used on a contract basis before. We're asking to go out and find that special skill set because, and it's been enlightening in all of the conversations that I've listened to and all the different people I've talked to, and what we're seeing being advertised to encourage people to turn their retirement over. To find the people behind these fraudulent companies in this new world, it takes a different expertise to dig away at the layers and find them. That's what we're wanting to go after.
Fair enough. Thank you. Thank you, Deputy. Is there any other public testimony? Yep. Mr. Allen, go ahead. And then after Mr. Allen, you once again restate your name, and then I'll have you come up, sir.
Christopher Allen, Blockchain Commons. I guess I have a sandbox and an ethics question for you. So the sandbox question is, Clearly from some of the ones that have been submitted, there's, we can talk about the spam, and we'll if we charge something, we wouldn't have gotten the spam. But then you have this twin goal. I think Matthew, and I think I'm kind of in this category as well, just wants a demonstration of something that's real, that works, that is a token, that is a property in Wyoming with whatever restrictions we have to deal with because of US. And then there's a separate goal, which is let's influence the US, let's influence the SEC and other states to do the right thing. And those conflict. And I'm wondering if there's some way to have kind of like a safe harbor council or something that can basically say, hey, we're gonna have a citizens committee that are going to encourage, maybe even officially allow, I don't know what the right thing is. Because I mean, I would love to see, for instance, an airlift ticket, not airlift, a ski lift ticket that was a token. That, hey, I've got a ski lift ticket for, the week of whatever, and it's looks like it's going to be great snow that week. I'm not going to be able to go. I can sell it for a profit because I can't go. That's, Wyoming residents. It's a service provided in Wyoming. And even if they're not a resident of Wyoming, they have to come to Wyoming to buy it and sell it. So that feels safe as far as that's clearly state commerce. So I'd like to see that happen. But I'd also like to see the influence on the big thing, and maybe some kind of safe harbor or citizen council or advisory thing to the people who are submitting might help bring out the good and weed out some of the bad. And then there's just sort of there's this sort of ethics and in all of this stuff. We tend to talk about regulation, but is there any discussion about creating some ethical standards and an ethical body that basically can bring up and discuss these types of things? I was noticing in the Malta documents that they were basically creating a body to basically allow, they're not making regulations, they're not doing anything except advising, but they're approaching it from an ethics point of view. And there's a lot of things here where we can say, well, the real ethical reasons why we're doing this does not match what the regulations side of this is, and be able to articulate that, and then be able to make help you draft formal statements that are, hey, this is the blockchain task force of Wyoming, and here is our ethical standards on this type of stuff after review of a citizen committee.
Any questions for Mr. Allen? Seeing none, thank you, sir. And I've got you next, sir, and you're going to have to state your name for the mic. This is your first time up, so welcome, sir.
Hello, my name is Charles Dushek of Nodehaven, and just give a little bit of experience about what we've gone through over the past 3 months as we started looking at different domiciles as far as going, where are we going to situate the company, and how we made the decision to become a Wyoming LLC, as far as use the definition that was outlined within House Bill 70. And then also what our hopes were when we originally did it, and then when we dug into it, what we found out as far as the limitations, right? And so I'd heard mentioned earlier that there might be some sort of workaround as far as having LLCs that are registered for the express purpose of buying tokens within the state. I think that's been excluded through federal law already, as far as being able to make a workaround in that sort of particular situation is what we've generally come to the conclusion.
Can you cite that for me, Charles?
Where it comes from?
Where the federal law says you can't do that.
Yes, it's in, I don't have it in front of me right now. I did have it in a, it's, if you go look up on interstate exemption on the sec.gov site, it'll say that loophole is pretty much closed. You can have, and they need to be residents. There's a lot of restrictions as far as who's able to purchase those securities or exempt securities, what exempts as far as being inside the state. I mean, it's really excluding everything.
But
right?
if this wasn't considered a security, then they wouldn't apply.
If the security sale is if it's considered a security, you have, well, we, okay, you're right, exactly. As far as the property thing, that's where things start getting, very creative, right? And I don't know, as far as, how the federal government looks at it. And of course, on my side, I want to be as safe as possible.
Sure.
Because, it potentially having, $500 million per run in 2019, and having 3 to 4 runs of equipment that we would go and produce, that's risking billions of dollars worth of revenue for our customers, as well as the people that have purchased the tokens. And then I imagine most people that are trying to do one of these systems legitimately and that aren't, have some sort of shady purposes, are looking to protect their particular project that they're going and executing. Although we did have the express purpose of wanting to stay in the United States because we live here, right? And I had no intentions of, I thought I was going to have to. But then when we looked at it, it really didn't matter. If I wanted to sell to United States citizens or people inside the United States, I was going to have to follow the same rules. And so now, we sit in a situation where we still want to follow the exemptions of the United States. And I would like to hear a little bit of elaboration on this property idea, and then what would constitute it being property, and how does that reflect as the cash or cryptocurrency collected during the token sale? Is that considered the property that the token represents? Or are there some sort of definitions around what defines the token as being a right to property? I think that would help us, because that's kind of how we've already structured our token, as far as it is a representation of the assets that were, as far as the cash, the inventory of products, as well as the intangible engineering expense. That's how ours was always designed, right? As far as becoming a utility token initially when we started working on our particular project. And it fits in line with the right to property. Although you don't have the right, you lose the ability to collect the whole right to the property as we go and develop up a product, right? And so there is this conflict during that period of time that you have trust within my particular company, Notehaven, that, I could see in the federal level would be considered as security. As far as that trust in that time period. And so reconciling that, I guess if we sold outside, now for us, it's now once we cross over to the state line, and that also includes publication too, and how you advertise. So if I advertise on the internet or have a website, I'm already offering over state lines, right? So then how do I make sure that the offering stays inside Wyoming only? Now, if it's a sale of property inside Wyoming, maybe that becomes a different issue. And if there's some clear-cut guidelines where we can follow that, we could sell the tokens in Wyoming as property, and then I wouldn't, then it didn't matter. I could sell a security that looks different, and it still will have to look different, because as far as when we sell them to the broader the United States, in order for us to maintain the exemption, we can't have them transferred by the person that purchases it. Like they can't, they have to have that block for 12 months. So we're going to have to, store them in the smart contract where they don't transfer them. So it will look different, right? As if I sold them inside Wyoming, or if I sold them to the broader United States under an exemption of securities law. So it starts getting complicated when I go try to execute it. But if there was some clarification on what constitutes a token being a right to property, that might give us a window in order for us to use it inside Wyoming while still offering an exempt security within the United States, and then also an exempt security to the regulation as, to the broader foreign markets. So that's where I'm at with it. But I appreciate the help, and I definitely am on board with whatever y'all decide to do. Any help y'all need, let me know.
Well, thank you, Charles. Any questions? Seeing none, thank you, sir.
Okay.
Mr. Kramer. And once again, state your name for the record. I know it's tedious.
You got it down pat.
Yeah.
Kevin Kramer with Mito Play. I just wanted to respond to Mr. Allen's suggestion. Being a skier, I would love the idea of a skier token. However, I'm representing a company who would love to do that with lottery today. We could actually make a Blocko Lotto game that is completely token driven, that would operate for citizens of Wyoming only to play a crypto lottery with our crypto tokens, which would be full token utility within the state of Wyoming. We're planning to have the software available here very shortly, and it will probably be part of our conversations. Lottery of it just becomes another game. The lottery operates. We become a provider to them, much the way Powerball is a provider to them. It's a completely crypto lottery where you're using a token to purchase, and you win in tokens based on the jackpots that go in there. And that would be a very public show of token utility and a utility token under House Bill 70, where we could sell those as property or under the exemption within Wyoming. So something as we think about talking to lottery people, which I'm going to follow up with for you guys to also prompt them with, which is we could do a full blockchain-based lottery game under the Wyoming lottery charter. My only concern would be the credit card payments, and if we'd have to wait for the legislative session to be able to do something around that.
Any questions for Mr. Kramer? Seeing none, thank you, sir. Any other testimony in regards to House Bill number 70? Oh, yes, sir. You got to state your name for the record, sorry.
Victor Miller. And the interstate commerce part of it got me thinking of something else we did a while back with the exemption to firearm construction. And to my understanding, no one built a machine gun in Wyoming because the metal comes from somewhere else or whatever. And did we ever get any feedback from the federal government on that? And then on an aside, I'm kind of curious how he would keep it Wyoming only, and if we could use that for other structures also and just keep it Wyoming.
So I think you're speaking of the Wyoming Firearms Freedom Act, and that allows for firearms that are constructed within the state of Wyoming using Wyoming materials, sold to a Wyoming resident, to be without any kind of GCA, the Gun Control Act type of regulatory structure, as in no serial numbers, what have you. It's a super fun law. I think it was awesome. Senator Rothfuss might disagree with me.
Interstate commerce.
Yeah, so the interstate commerce is you cannot sell it to an individual from outside of the state of Wyoming. You have to be inside the state, and they have to check your ID to make sure your driver's license, just like a regular background. Well, just like buying a pistol in the state of Wyoming, they're required to check your ID.
And then, secondly, what kind of framework would we have if we wanted a token to only be in Wyoming, even?
I think that would be self-governing. The way I read the law, that would be self-governing upon you as the issuer to verify the identity and location of those that you're selling to. It would be my opinion. Anybody else want to? Yeah, go ahead, Co-Chair.
Earlier, that they use location services on the phone as well.
Oh,
so if you've got an app, it'll tell you where the location's at.
Mr. Chairman?
Senator Rothfuss?
While that can happen, you can also obviously design and intentionally design your token so that it doesn't have any locational services, so that it's basically anonymous, and so that you're an anonymous token holder. And even if I'm the primary developer of that token and I have an initial sale of it, if it's a resellable token, then how am I going to be responsible that that resale is going to take place in the state? I mean, it's really a difficult concept to make sure that the sale doesn't trickle across the state border.
I think
Mr. Co-Chair,
actually make it where it's legal to do it. If they initially sell it inside the state, it's legal. Another entity then can resell it as a private entity across the state line or anywhere at that point. It's up to the individual. Because that's what we've been talking about. It can go over state lines once it's in individual hands. It's just for the minting of it, if it was Wyoming only, they'd have to verify that first level, but the next level of trade would be wide open the way I see it.
Mr. Chairman, I think that's definitely how it is. I don't know if that conforms to or meets the concerns that we had with getting into a space where the SEC was going to be concerned. And again, I don't know that we have any test cases to know that from.
Go ahead, Mr. Co-Chair.
I don't think until the SEC moves, there's anything we can do other than carefully proceed down a path that we think is prudent.
That's fair,
and wait for them to act. Because otherwise, you do nothing.
Mr. Pope.
Mr. Chairman, I actually just looked up on the SEC website, Section 3A11 of the Securities Act. It's the intrastate offering exemption. There are 3 qualifications: that it be organized in the state where it is offering the securities, carry out a significant amount of its business in that state, and make offers and sales only to residents of that state. And further down, it says that securities purchased in an offering under Rule 147 limit resales to persons residing within the state of the offering for a period of 6 months from the date of the sale by the issuer to the purchaser. So for the first 6 months, at least, the sales have to be intrastate under that exception.
If it was a security.
If it is a security. So if we're
Right, we've said
following,
it's not.
right, if we're following securities law, though, which was one of the questions,
Right.
then that exemption exists.
Gotcha. Does that help, sir?
Yes, it does. I believe it's our charge to prime the pump, and the federal government will be following along, hopefully. So
I hope you're right.
We'll go forward and get some test cases for you all.
Thank you, Mr. Miller. Any other? Seeing none, I'm going to close discussion or public testimony, and I'm going to hand the chairmanship off to Co-Chairman Driscoll.
I will take control of the meeting and accept a motion on a bill draft.
Mr. Chairman? So I would like to move that House Bill 70, that we draft a piece of legislation that extracts House Bill 70 from the Uniform Security Act, puts it into property title, and at the same time, I'm trying to find my notes here that I took. Well, actually, you know what, Mr. Chairman, and the reason I'm just going to go ahead and do this aspect by itself, and hope you'll support me in this regard. Let's pull it out of the Uniform Security Act, redraft it under title or under property law, and leave it like that till the next meeting. And in my opinion, I think that keeps us from getting too muddled up right off the bat. And then at the second meeting, we can run all the amendments we want to the thing once we have a starting point.
I'll second.
Oh, double second.
Okay, we've had a motion and done it. Chris, you're comfortable with?
Mr. Chairman, just for clarification, are we moving on property-based approach, or are we doing something different?
We're actually making a motion on 70 that's going to give you basically an open draft, which we've done these before. Representative Lindholm or Co-Chairman Lindholm will work with you along with anyone else on developing a draft. So we've got something next meeting that's a rewrite of part of 70, roughly in the framework he's done. Are you comfortable with that? With that, we have a.
Mr. Chairman, I think the question there, though, is if the next agenda item is property-based approach to digital assets, should we make this motion after we go through that so that we can better understand kind of what the implications are, what's been done before, and if we've got a technical overview of the proposal from the LSO, I'd rather hear that before I voted on that.
Very well. Yeah, Mr. Co-Chairman, are you amicable?
I'll go ahead and withdraw my my motion as my second
I'll
agreement.
just leave it on the table.
Okay.
It's no problem. Leave it on the table.
Sure.
We don't have to-
Mr. Chairman, are we all right with a 5-minute break?
We are.
Before we move on to the second bit?
Yeah, let's do a 5-minute break. So we'll be back 5:25. It'll be a 7-minute break.
Yeah. Good. I'm a clown. Sorry. All right, we'll come back to order. And we're going to kick off our next section, which will be led by LSO staff, Mr. Land, in regards to property-based approach to digital assets. Mr. Land, if you finish before 6, that puts us on time. So
I will be.
Go ahead, Mr.
Are we
Land.
on? Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will be as brief and succinct and detailed as possible.
Perfect.
First of all, just to kind of set the stage, LSO is a nonpartisan organization. So when I'm talking about this, I'm not advocating for any piece of legislation. I'm just kind of giving you the technical overview of what you might consider. So there was some comments in their previous discussion about how state property law has primacy under U.S. Supreme Court precedent and various other common law doctrines. But if you'll turn to the document in your meeting materials, it's labeled Property-Based Approach to Digital Assets, Technical Overview. That's kind of what I'm going to go through real quick, and then we'll open the discussion up to you guys and the public. Does everyone have that up?
That's members, that's under the tab Property Approach to Digital Assets, if you're looking for it in your books. Go ahead, Mr. Land.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So the U.S. Supreme Court is found that lots of kinds of interests can be defined as property, and it's a very fact-specific legislative determination that the courts are kind of loath to get into. Legislatures, especially on the state level, have a lot of freedom to kind of define the classes of property. One example of this in Wyoming law, you may not know, but pre-written computer software is currently defined in Wyoming statutes as a tangible property interest. And you think it would be intangible, right?
Right.
But that's the way the law is, and the legislature has some freedom to kind of massage.
Do you know the background on why that is, Mr. Land?
I do not know, Mr. Chairman. It's been in the laws for at least a couple of sessions. I don't think either of us were around when it was enacted. So, but that kind of gives you the background of kind of some of the freedom this task force might have to define what a property interest is. So there's a really interesting definition of property that I think is under the subheading characteristics of property law. This is from the Ninth Circuit, which is not where Wyoming is located under federal law. We're in the 10th Circuit, but I thought this was a fairly representative definition of what property was in the legal sense. 3 elements. It's an interest capable of a precise definition. It has to be capable of exclusive possession or control, and the putative owner must have established a legitimate claim to controlling the object of the property. So anything that if you can classify something as fitting within that definition, I think under common law doctrine and federal and state law, I think you'd be fairly secure as calling it property. And there's been a lot of scholarly debate in law reviews and law journals about whether what kind of digital assets are property. And I've listed 2 of the articles there. The Byron article especially is delved into a bit about how the Uniform Commercial Code in various places, you have to pledge property as collateral under the UCC. And Bitcoin has been accepted as collateral property under the Uniform Commercial Code and other cryptocurrencies. So I think there might be a basis here for this committee to consider shifting certain digital assets like open blockchain tokens potentially from House Bill 70 to a more property-based approach versus just creating an exemption from securities, because when you create an exemption from the securities laws, you have to presuppose that it was a security to begin with, and that's where you start your analysis, right? But if you were to classify it as property, there would be a number of different rights and duties that the holder of the property, and for example, with someone who wanted to inherit that property from someone else, might have that they wouldn't necessarily have under securities laws. One thing I do want to note, though, and bring to the committee's attention, the courts aren't stupid either. The federal government certainly isn't stupid.
Which court, Mr. Land? Which court are you referring to?
I don't know. You can go with that wherever you will, Mr. Chairman. But if I was to call this, a chicken, if the legislature of the state of Wyoming wanted to call this recorder a chicken, it would be a chicken under Wyoming law. But the courts aren't stupid, and they're gonna look into the background of why you called it a chicken, and does that comport with the reality of it is a chicken in everyday society. So like we just have to be careful and thoughtful and creative about how we define these open blockchain tokens or whatever other digital assets that we want to classify as property. We just have to make sure there's a nexus to reality. We just aren't calling it, a chicken just for calling it a chicken's sake and trying to get away with that. There has to be a nexus to reality, I think, for it to be legally defensible. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'll stand for any questions.
Mr. Chairman? Yeah, go ahead, Senator.
Thank you. So the concept makes a lot of sense for us to move that over, but then my question would be, why can't we just declare under Wyoming statute that securities are property?
Mr. Land?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think the short answer to that, and not being a securities lawyer, but based on my research and knowledge, I think that's the way it's always been done. And
Mr. Kaufman.
That's what it's always been called.
I know
Mr. Kaufman probably has a
leading forward,
more detailed answer.
Mr. Chairman, I think legally securities are a form of property. I don't think that's debated at all. Securities are something that you can own and convey and transfer just like any other form of property. There just happened to be a whole separate body of regulations around the selling and the purchase and the act of purchasing and selling securities. So does that answer your question?
Mr. Chairman, it does to some degree, but I guess if we're trying to make a distinction or delineation by moving it, and that's the concept here that we're talking about, for moving it from the securities statutes to the property statutes as a way of not having it fall under securities law, I guess I'm just concerned that, well, we could do that with state securities as well and try and do the same workaround, but that's not going to fly. That's clearly not going to get us anywhere with the federal regulations. So I'm trying to see if there's anything else that helps us to delineate what we're talking about here, which then we can call a property but not a security, and it's different from a security in a traditional sense.
Mr. Land.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think this concept, for us to do it right, I think we would need to have a working group and really delve into, what distinguishes securities from property and really drill down on, consulting some of the industry experts. I think it can be done. I think if you decide it's worth study, I think it can be done. It will take some time, but again, it would continue to cement Wyoming's status as a leader in this area. I think it hasn't been done in another jurisdiction in the world from the property perspective. So
I think also on top of that, there is, it does go along with the lines, specifically with House Bill 70 last year. We did essentially state that a utility token is property by exempting it from securities. However, on top of that, moving forward, if we were to move it out of the Uniform Security Act, not only are we stating that it is not subject to the Uniform Security Act, but at that point also there's a clarification aspect that I think is important by pulling it away from the Uniform Security Act. Go ahead, Mr. Lamb.
Mr. Chairman, I want to circle back to something that Ms. Long said earlier about how, we're kind of operating in a new area of the law, and like it has, a utility token has certain distinguishing and unique characteristics that kind of place it out of touch with the current laws. And I think that there is enough of a distinction that can be made that there would be a significant property hook. And just the uses of utility tokens are so different than traditional securities. I think it can be done, but I'm going to do something I don't do a lot and say, there's a lot I don't know about the property approach, and I think that it would be certainly worth some study. It will take some time, but I think it can be done if this task force is interested. I think it's a promising area that no other jurisdiction has done, but the rest is up to our hard work, I guess.
Ms. Long.
Mr. Chairman, it may be worth sharing the background that this feedback came into us during the HB 70 process, as you may recall, Mr. Chairman, from New York's based Securities Council. who, when they saw the press coverage, rolled up sleeves and helped us. And one of them said, gosh, I wish that you had actually done it as property from the get-go, because if this is ever litigated, it's just so much cleaner for the Wyoming company that availed itself of the law if it's entirely pulled out of securities law. That's not to say that the regulator's not going to be the same. Maybe we need to propose changing the securities division to be securities and utility token division. Obviously no. I'm not suggesting changing anything other than the geography within the law, because, and that was his point. It was exactly as you prepared, and thank you for preparing this. He drew this very distinction. Federal securities have been litigated on this point. There is a lot of case law. I'm not an expert in that, that there is federal supremacy in securities. That has gone up to the Supreme Court, but not property.
But conversely, Mr. Chairman, if I may, on the other side of the coin, there's tons of cases out there that said property law is the venue of the states, and that Congress wasn't given that power under the U.S. Constitution, accepting, areas of property that have a nexus to interstate commerce, like securities. So,
Mr. Chairman.
All right, go ahead, Senator.
Thank you. Following up with a couple of questions, have there been any cases, or is there any case law where securities were tested as property and the federal supremacy ended up winning out, or anything else along those lines?
Mr. Land or Mr. Cox?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, so when you say property, are you likening it to real property or personal property? Because in the context of personal property, I would say that's a fundamental tenet of securities law, is that securities are personal property. If you're likening it to real property, that's totally different, obviously.
Mr. Chairman, the concept that Chris is talking about is the idea that we generally have supremacy over property law. So if we're writing statute, then there'll be deference to state property law. And I'm curious whether any state has tried to use that authority to govern or influence securities law in the face of the feds, and whether there was any case law associated with that.
Mr. Land?
Senator Rothfuss, I can't give you an accurate determination of that question. I would, just like on House Bill 70, we're really out in front of the rest of the country right now. So I would suspect not. Nothing serious.
It's the marijuana of Wyoming?
You said that, I didn't, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman?
I had Ms. Long first.
Okay.
I did just confirm the Howey test came out of a Supreme Court case.
Yeah, it did.
So that is supreme law of the land. If you don't fail the Howey test, you are a security and you are governed by federal securities laws. But if you do fail the Howey test, then you may not be a security.
And Mr. Chairman, if I may, at the same time, I wonder how the Howey test could be applied to, I could probably come up with 5 different examples of how the Howey test could be applied to non-securities, but it isn't. So.
We are talking about a Supreme Court case regarding orange groves?
Yeah.
Is that correct?
That's correct, Mr.
So,
Chairman.
and it is 80, 90 years old, Mr. Coffin?
Yeah, I don't know. It's old.
1940s.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mr. Pope, you had a point.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Removing it from the securities section and treating it as property actually creates a very practical effect. And one of the best examples is Section 509. I guess that's 17-4-509. In House Bill 70, it says a developer or issuer or seller of an open blockchain token shall not be deemed the issuer of a security, if it, of course, meets the qualifications. But then if you look at, but it does not exempt. It exempts it from 17-4-301 through 17-4-412 and 17-4-504, but it does not exempt it from 17-4-509. So 17-4-509 creates a private right of action, and the exact wording is, let's see, A person is liable to the purchaser if the person sells a security. So a utility token is subject to 509. Yet it's stated specifically that that the issuer is not selling a security. Yet in order to avail themselves of 509, a consumer has to say that they were sold a security. So you have an immediate defense. The issuer has an immediate defense in court. So removing it from that and creating its own set of, or its own private right of action, or its own separate section, and treating it as property fixes that immediately, as long as you don't refer back to 509.
I don't disagree with that, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Mr. Kaufman, thoughts?
Mr. Pope brings up a good point, Mr. Chairman, and I was just starting to think through, and I'll keep my comment really brief because I'm going to have to contemplate this, but there are a number of private causes of action that have been created under federal securities laws and case law throughout the country that apply to an individual purchaser, that regardless of what the type of security is, if they've been aggrieved or defrauded, or there's a number of different causes of action. Now, I understand we're not trying to create separate causes of action, but I'm just thinking to the Secretary of State's point earlier about the potentially aggrieved purchaser of something that, whether it was fraudulent or not, whether it was a token or not, I would hate to have them forfeit any private right to, as an avenue towards recovery. So I'm not suggesting anything yet, but I think that's another aspect of this that we should consider.
Mr. Chairman, I would, just as a technical comment, I would like to, there are tons of common law causes of action that are associated with property. That's one of the oldest parts of the common law is property. And I think there would be a number of causes of action that would be available under a common law property doctrine that we could explore that already exist. So.
And
Ms. Long, go ahead.
Just to reiterate, we did discuss at great length during the HB 70 process, including the amendments requested from the Secretary of State to apply the securities fraud statutes to utility tokens. And I would not be in favor of changing that. In other words, I feel like the state of Wyoming has already made that decision and should not change. That should not change just because we've lifted it out of the securities chapter, securities title.
I think on that point, if we get into working a piece of legislation where we withdraw this portion from the Uniform Security Act, I do think it is a point not to refer back to the Security Act in that new legislation, but to write out, redraft under their own. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
That's
instead of referring back.
Yeah.
Mr. Chairman, that this gives us the opportunity to go back and fix and do all of this housekeeping and create a really strong bill that comes out of it, and where we don't have this cross-referencing that is just that makes parts of the fraud sections unusable.
Right.
Mr. Chairman?
Go ahead, Senator.
Thanks. I have two questions. The first one is, one of the things we did change last session was we removed cryptocurrencies so that they were specifically not property. And that was an action we took from a property tax standpoint. If we're putting this under property, are there any implications? I don't necessarily think there would be, but as now this is a property, maybe there's an assessment associated with it. How will it be treated from a taxation standpoint?
Mr. Chairman, or Senator, and Mr. Land, I think I can kind of handle that one. So we exempted it from property taxation, thereby declaring it to be property, much like gold and silver or any other currency, by stating that it is exempt from property taxation. We're stating that it is property. Is my, I guess, my reading of Senate File 111.
Mr. Chairman, we only included virtual currencies, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm misremembering the statute.
That's correct, Mr. Chairman.
Okay.
So these utility tokens, we wouldn't have any, there's nothing in that statute that would refer back to this. But now if we're including it under property, we're saying this is property. I'm wondering if there are any implications from a taxation standpoint.
That might be a good inclusion on section 2.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, I would just like to throw out there that, cryptocurrencies and open blockchain tokens are not necessarily synonymous.
Right.
So we've already exempted one, but, moving one to the property title wouldn't necessarily be a deal breaker, I would think, legally speaking.
Right. Mr. Chairman, I was thinking in the other direction. I agree that what you're saying isn't going to influence the cryptocurrency over here, but this idea that we're declaring a utility token or an open blockchain token as property, I'm wondering if there are any implications from a taxation standpoint if we now classify it as property. And that's something
I think that would be something for us to look into, or something for you guys to decide, honestly, because I think we would have some latitude, legally speaking, in that area.
Mr. Chairman, and
go ahead, Senator.
Follow up on that. Another thought I have is with regard to the portability from state to state, as well as the recognition from state to state. When we're talking about this intrastate concept, we have a lot of concept of why that works from an SEC standpoint, from the exemption, and we've kind of worked through that idea. Now, if we're saying this is property, and we're defining it, the state of Wyoming is defining this as property, and other states don't define it as property, what are the implications of that? And recognizing that we typically have uniform law related to property, I don't know what the implications would be if, I carry my utility token to Colorado. What are they going to think of it there?
Mr. Land.
Mr. Chairman, that's another area that I would like to do some research and do some serious thought about. Just my firsthand impressions, though, is there have been a number of actions regarding Bitcoin, especially, but other cryptocurrencies under the Uniform Commercial Code, kind of interpreting that in the same way. So it might just happen naturally.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I guess maybe there are analogs where state A does define something as property, but other states don't. There has to have been a way that was handled in the past.
Mr. Chairman,
Go ahead, Mr.
thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, I think that's a great point, Senator Rothfuss. Pre-written computer software, I suspect, isn't tangible personal property in most states. It's probably intangible property or something, another category. And, I think that would be one of those difficult questions that make people like me a lot of money in the courts. So, yeah.
Well, I'm all for it.
That's terrifying in its own right. I will, on that note, also note that I came to the legislature to vote on gun bills. I don't know how I ended up.
Great work.
Yeah, right. Any other questions? Ms. Long, go
Just
ahead.
an additional comment, Mr. Chairman. There has been a fair amount of work done on the legal status of things like airline miles that are probably decent analogs here.
Sure.
Yeah,
There are secondary markets for those, so those are trading across states, but they're not regulated as securities. Gift cards is another one.
Yeah.
I think they're not as high profile as digital assets, so that might be one of the reasons they haven't been regulated.
Right.
But yeah, the SEC might look at airline miles one day. Who knows?
Any other Mr. Land, is that about a wrap for you?
It does, Mr. Chairman. Just a brief note: if we do want to move forward with the digital assets as property idea, I would ask that you consider appointing a working group to work with me so that we can start moving forward as soon as possible, because it's a fairly complicated topic.
Absolutely,
as you can imagine. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Public testimony. Yeah, go ahead, Mr. Jennings. And I'll also state your name again for that.
Rob Jennings, thank you, Mr. Chairman. One thing we are working on is the Taco John's Taco Token. So we're talking with them about hopefully using that as a utility token here in the state. One thing, you're talking about creating property, and this could help the state, but something to consider also is how, and we had been contacted by a woman. She is a former Ernst & Young person. What she does now for the past 15 years is help big companies like Walmart, Ralph Lauren, and others protect their unclaimed gift card monies, which Delaware goes after very rapidly. And what she's been doing for the past 15 or 20 years is carving off their gift card businesses and bringing them here to Wyoming and putting them in Wyoming LLCs and protecting those, basically shielding Delaware, who after 5 years goes after that 20 cents and the 10 cents. They collect $500 million a year in unclaimed property, as sheep, they call it, whatever it is. But I would say in these laws, when you're considering this, one, we should allow people to protect their digital assets in the state. But two, you could set up a mechanism for claiming unclaimed digital assets, which I think is coming. We haven't really gotten into being we've not even gotten into that matter about what happens to unclaimed digital assets, but it should be something to consider in the legislation because it could be quite lucrative for the state should people have unclaimed digital assets in the future. Thanks.
Any questions? Seeing none. Thank you, Mr. Jennings. Any other public testimony? Seeing none. Oh, go ahead, Charles. Come on. You got to state your name again. Sorry.
No problem. Hello, my name is Charles Dushek in Note Haven. And I had just a quick question as far as property and the token. Is the token the property, or is the underlying service or product that it represents a right to the property?
Mr. Dushek, is that correct?
Yes, Dushek.
Dushek. So in this consideration, if this were to go all the way through, the way I understand the proposed motion and legislation and the idea, technically both would be considered. The token, the utility token would be considered property plus the goods and service and trade for.
Okay. And then I guess, so in the Howey test, is the orange the property? I mean, like, so, when you think about the farm and the orange and the service and all that kind of stuff, I was just, there's a piece there is which part of it constitutes security and which of it constitutes a piece of property. Just kind of bringing that up. And there is a partition kind of way to go about looking at that sort of thing. But when you start, I think for me, whenever I'm thinking, if I can define is the token the property or is the product or service, that starts getting kind of blurry in my head as far as is it the representation of it or is it the actual token being the property that the person's owning? That may be a clarification that could help.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. Any questions? Seeing none. Thank you, Mr. Dushek. Mr. Allen.
Question more for you, but I'll bring it up. So with blockchain and smart contracts and things of that nature, you end up having a lot more flexibility insofar as things like we've already talked about tokens that can't be sold after a particular period, but there may be real economic reasons why someone may wish a token to expire. And given the characteristic of property law in the first point in this section, that may make it such that it isn't covered there. So you may want to look at the issues of whether or not token expiration invalidates that it falls under one of these categories. So there may be other things that legitimate reasons why you might want to discount a token. There were these things called scripts used in the 30s where basically the token went down in value over a period of time so that there wouldn't be too much capacity. Imagine Ski Coin, who has a capacity at their place for X number of thousands of ski rides a day, and people start collecting them and they all want to go on January 20th. And there isn't enough capacity for January 20th. So they may want to create tokens on a smart contract that basically limit in some fashion or expire over time or say, well, in these kinds of situations, we're not going to give you a ski lift tour. We're going to give you a discount on a ski lift tour because everybody's trying to get it at the same time. Could that violate this property provision to add those additional smart contracts possibilities on tokens? And I don't know if it does or doesn't, but it might be, it's worthy of investigation.
Okay. Any questions?
Mr. Chairman?
Go ahead, Senator.
And I don't know if you're the right person to ask this, but I've been thinking about, we're calling it token property, and that's kind of what we're looking at here. it almost seems like it's always a contract. And then the terms of the contract are all of the things that we're writing. So it is always a smart contract, even for, for the tacos, for the skiing, for everything else. It is a digital representation of a contract where I get to take this contract, make it portable. I own the contract, or I own a portion of the contract. And I don't know what that does from our property discussion, or whether that's useful or not, but that's how you see it as well.
Yes. I think along that line, I think that's why Mr. Land brought up the aspects of the intangible property versus tangible property being considered software, right? Because
yeah, but Mr. Chairman, but I can see that a lot easier than in this instance. You're buying a contract for goods, where that's basically what you're doing with a token, buying a contract for goods and services. And
which is assignable.
Yeah, and exactly, yeah, a transferable, signable contract for goods and services. That's what this utility token basically is. The computer code is not that, right? The computer code still is a thing. It's intellectual property. It's much more like our standard view of intellectual property, where it's a product. It's a piece of music. It's a published book. And it does have a function where the others do to a various degree. But I don't know at that point if there's even a third place then for it, or if there's a different way to treat it. And maybe a security is the same thing. Is a security simply a contract? Is that really what it is at its heart? The same a contract for goods or services? Is that also a security?
I think much like a security, both can be owned, both can be transferred, both belong. So I think that's where they both end up being somewhat property. The difference being is securities have the Uniform Security Act applied to them because they are strictly an investment.
Sure. So, I mean, well, we can agree that the details of these two contracts are different. The details of a security contract are different from the details as we're defining them of a utility token contract. I can't have this be an investment and my contract over on the security side is going to be an investment in the end, and that's where we're going to delineate. And I guess that's still going to work as property, because my contract for the assignable and transferable contract for goods and services is the piece of property. And I think a contract can basically be a piece of property. I assume that's fair in statute. Chris, is that?
Mr. Land, you want to take a stab at that?
As I was just telling Kelly, this reminds me of my well property. Really deep discussion about some of the core aspects of what is property and what is investment. I think that's a good useful discussion for the task force to have. Pretty easy answer.
So, Mr. Land, are you telling me you pay someone to have these conversations? Is that? All right. I think Mr. Kaufman's got a point.
Yeah, I'm sure. I just want to say out loud for my own benefit more than anybody's, but ultimately I don't really care where this legislation lands, what title of the statute
You're on
it's
the
in.
task force, I hope you do.
Well, but I mean, whether it's in Title 17 or Title 18, I don't really care. But in my mind, what Senator Rothfuss was just hitting on is exactly what the Supreme Court has at great lengths ruled on, and what the SEC is fumbling over time and time again, and that is defining what is it. I mean, ultimately it's a right to receive something, right?
Mm-hmm.
What the Howey test ultimately defines is what's the expectation of the buyer in receiving that right. And what the Howey test ultimately sets up is I'm expecting a profit out of that, right? So if the expectation is a profit, now we go down this path of securities. It could be a contract, it could be a number of different things. And so that's where this piece of legislation, House Bill 70, I think is really unique, because we define that intent is not an expectation of profit. The intent is a consumptive purpose. It's a good or a service. So to me, that's ultimately where the focus should be. Because at the end of the day, yeah, probably a lot of this is going to be executed on some smart contract basis. And I think, again, in my own brain, the more it's kind of to me, the closer we stay to the securities aspect to create a clear distinction, in some ways, the safer it is, at least in my brain, as opposed to just what Mr. Lamb was referring to of, let's call it something completely different. I totally understand and get the argument that that creates a clear delineation for someone in court saying, no, it's not even in that title of the statute, but I don't think that argument goes very far myself. So I'm saying this for my own benefit more than anything. I think it really doesn't matter where it lies. We have to focus more on that consumptive purpose and making sure that the policy of the law is getting at the intent, and that the intent is not to sell someone an instrument that creates an expectation of profit. The intent is that it sells something that's a consumptive purpose.
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead, Ms. Long.
And also one clarification, it absolutely is required in both cases that it is not sold for an investment purpose. That's where I think a lot of these will actually trip up, is that there is effectively investment marketing happening for these ICOs, in which case they're clearly in the securities zip code, even if they meet all of the other requirements.
Mr. Dushek? Yes. Once again, you gotta go through the motion again, sorry.
Yes, Charles Dushek, Note Haven. And, as far as, we're talking about securities and property and things of that nature. And then, we're kind of discussing the idea of development, that period where they can sell the token. It's a piece of property at that point, but what is the underlying right that has to be developed over time that's going to be done with those particular funds? That's where I think the muddiness comes between, a security and a gift card, per se, that these digital tokens can represent, right? And so that the closer you get to that point where you can use the token for that good, the closer it becomes the idea of property, and it moves away from an idea of security, because you no longer have to trust that particular person with that amount of funds. You can now trade it in for something that's real, or a service that may be, well, and then, okay, now I'm going to throw something else out there too. These, most of the systems are decentralized or have some sort of intent on being trustless systems where they're selling the tokens, and that there's no one particular party that's responsible for giving the service or product. Mine's a little bit different, where I'm actually, a company that's providing a good, and has more of a cooperative type model. But the majority of these tokens being sold, there's nobody to really hold responsible for the service or good in the end, after the system's developed. So that's a whole nother topic that I think that we're kind of touching on. Inside Wyoming, most of the cases will be actual goods or services that, you can point to somebody and say they're responsible for them having them. But the majority of the ones in the world are systems that are being set up that there's no particular person that should have any responsibility for providing that service or good, right? So that's part of it that makes it a little bit more muddy. But my only concern is that you're never going to get away from this idea of security while the person is selling a token today and the product's going to be developed 6 months from now, right? Like as far as in the federal level, I don't feel that that's ever going to really go away. But it is clear to me that people do have gift cards, and there are some trading and things like that, and it's very easy for me to see that that's property, and that's governed by a whole nother Federal Trade Commission, I guess, governs gift cards, right? And that I really don't even see them being involved in this discussion at all up to date, that there may be some sort of, I don't know if even Wyoming has anybody that's on that particular level.
We escheat gift cards through the State Treasurer's Office.
State Treasurer's Office.
And then the only reason I know that is I tried to stop that in 2015.
Okay.
Because I think it's ridiculous that we collect gift cards.
Yeah, because that for me is the most analogous, right, to the utility token, and whoever governs that, I think, should be probably regulating it.
Oh, don't say that. Secretary's office.
All right.
Mr. Chairman, go ahead, Senator. on that, actually, Division of Banking Commissioner does oversee that, because that falls under, I believe, the Wyoming Money Transfers Act, since it's a transmission of value and therefore he governs it. You're right, when it's collecting, when that it's abandoned, then it goes back to the treasurer. But I'm pretty sure that Commissioner Faulkner has oversight over it.
Sure.
Over gift cards to the state, and he took off a little while ago, so we can't ask.
Oh, well, we could always delegate.
We'll summon him
authority.
back. Let's call him right now.
All right, that's all I've got. And I think just before but before you can actually use it, that period is real, I mean, for me, I have a tough time understanding how it's not a security until there's a product or service in place.
Sure.
Because you're trusting somebody with some money. That's just my own personal.
Yeah, and I think Mr. Dushek, I think you're absolutely on point. That belies a lot of the problem that other states, the SEC, and all of these organizations are having, and hence the popularity of Wyoming's laws. The fact that we did decide to make a decision because it is not, it's not something that is easily grasped and can be pointed in one direction. And realistically, it'll take a legislative body, probably plus some court cases, to totally iron this deal out. And there we sit. I mean, that's the reality.
Okay.
I really appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Dushek. So I think with that, I'm going to go ahead and cut off public testimony because it's 6:15. And Mr. Land with LSO made us late. I'm going to blame him. That's not entirely the truth. It might be me being too gabby. So, I know. So going into, now that public testimony is closed, Co-Chairman Driscoll, I'm going to have you take back the reins. I'm going to open up my motion from prior, if that's all right.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman. Go ahead, Mr. Co-Chairman.
Okay, so Mr. Chairman, back to my original motion. I would like to amend that motion to include a section 3 or section 4, whatever it ends up being in the law, in regards to allowing the Secretary of State's office essentially authority under the 900 series to contract one employee or one contractor for the enforcement. I'm getting that head nod.
Second.
And I got that as a second. Yeah. Mr. Land, is that clear? Okay.
Moved, seconded. Any discussion?
Mr. Chairman, on that, did you say just one contractor?
Correct.
Do you want to be that specific, or do you want to say that they can use proceeds or they can use their 900 series? Because again, they'll use different contractors at different times, and it's not going to just be one. I'd suggest opening that up.
Mr. Co-Chair.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. If it's all right, I would like to call Deputy Wheeler back to testify in regards to this question.
Mr. Co-Chair. Welcome back, Deputy Wheeler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So Representative Lindholm, I guess first I would ask, is this section under the bill where you're moving it into property? Or is it part of House Bill 70? We're just trying to get clarification on our end.
Mr. Chairman? Deputy, this would be the bill that moves it out of the Uniform Security Act and moves it into property title. So this section 3 portion would not be anywhere in statute. It would essentially just be a direction just for your office. So it wouldn't be codified, I think is the best way to.
Mr. Chairman, Representative, thank you. And in response to what Senator Rothfuss said, we do, it would be better to not limit it to just one contractor.
Okay.
Mr. Co-Chairman, would you like to amend your motion?
Yes, I would. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to amend my motion to allow LSO staff to be to work maybe in regards to this specific portion with the Secretary of State's office to use the correct word verbiage in this direction.
I do have a point. Based on my knowledge of Wyoming constitutional law, once you put a 900 series or appropriation, I feel in the bill is subject to the line item power. I'm not sure that the task force wants to do that. If you do, then we'll do that, but otherwise, the government did item veto.
Mr. Chairman, I'm not scared.
Okay. Is this friendly amendment to the second motion?
Oh, yes, I would concur. On the second.
That being said, any more discussion on the motion?
And just clarification, Mr. Chairman, so this is back to so now that we've amended the original motion, so this is just as a clarification piece for the task force. This is to to draft legislation that pulls House Bill 70 out of the Uniform Security Act, put it into property law with an additional Section 3 for clarification of contract employees.
Mr. Chairman?
The
only other discussion I'd have is, I think we had a couple of things earlier that probably would be in House Bill 70 cleanup. If we wanted to, Caitlin, I think you had a change that you were requesting. We could get LSO to look at those drafts as they're doing it and then include them in a drafter's comment instead of actually in the bill. Does that make sense? So I'd ask for then leeway for LSO to incorporate some of those suggestions in their drafting comments so that we have the opportunity to implement them easily if that.
Senator Rothfuss, that's entirely in order, and I think for anybody that's got ideas, we can put it in, because we can easily strike them back out.
Yeah.
Next meeting, so if any of you have suggestions, take them to Chris at LSO, Representative Lindholm.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I guess I would ask Mr. Land to also include the suggestions in that regard from his presentation on property approach to digital assets that are listed for House Bill 70 there.
Yeah, and Mr. Chairman, I think the best way to do that is to just call that out in the LSO drafting notes so that they're not actually amending statute, but this is where we would do that. This is how we would do that. I know that we frequently do that in legislation drafts, so I think that's a good way to keep it clear.
All in order there. Any more discussion? Do we need a roll call where it involves money? We don't have to on this. All right. No. All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? No. Motion's passed. I think that we're done for the day unless Mr. Co-Chairman has anything else. Thank you, Deputy Wheeler. With that, we'll.
Do you want to see, Mr. Chairman? Do you want to see if there's any other general public comment before we adjourn?
Sure, we can do that.
They probably don't have any, but it's.
I wouldn't give them a chance. They come.
I understand. Most of them will be back, but I don't know if everyone was.
Where's Mark?
Hey,
I've never been.
That's his place.
We are adjourned till 9:30 tomorrow morning.
Okay.
Are we 9:30?
Yeah, 9:30.
I think for those that are going on the beef tour, that's at 8, I believe.
I thought it was 7.